Hey guys, tonight we embark on a simple journey. Not just any casual outing, but a stroll through a Victorian city street at dusk, where the atmosphere carries notes of toasted almonds, scorched caramel, and a subtle hint of butter. The surprising thing is, almost none of what we encounter is actually what it appears to be. You are stepping into a setting where edibles look appealing, taste sweet, and cost practically nothing, yet they come with an unspoken consequence nobody mentions. A realm where vibrant hues signal danger instead of delight, where the most inviting loaf of bread could easily contain a trace of pulverized rock, and where countless individuals built their daily existence, their physical well-being, and their entire recollections on sustenance that was fundamentally false. Alright, before you settle in, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, but please only proceed if you genuinely feel inclined to. And also let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is in your location. I am always interested to know who is connecting from around the globe. Dim the lighting, start that fan for a little ambient sound, and let us ease into this evening's small exploration. Your journey begins in the perfect spot for a curious observer, right at the cobblestone edge of a bustling Victorian street market. It is early evening. The sun is a warm gold but disappearing quickly. Street lamps are being ignited sequentially, shop by shop. The smoke drifting from coal fires winds lazily through the narrow paths, and the fragrance of warm baked goods clings to the air like rich fabric. A lively soundscape surrounds you, the scuffing of footwear, the chime of currency, the occasional bark from a nearby dog. Merchants shout their wares like performers on a stage. One is enthusiastically displaying sugar-coated almonds packaged in paper cones. Another offers slender strips of candied orange peel shimmering brightly under a gas lantern. To your left, someone is deep-frying something you cannot quite place, but the aroma is oddly tempting. The feeling is celebratory, the type of location where you would purchase a small indulgence, just a piece of candy to occupy a moment. You approach a kiosk where several children are gathered closely like insects to a light. Their faces illuminate at the sight of stacked trays holding bright pink and pale yellow confectionery cubes in tidy rows. Some are individually wrapped in thin paper, others sit exposed, reflecting every available light source. They are known as conversation lozenges, although the only exchange happening now is the quiet transaction between a coin offered and a handful of colourful squares received. You lean closer. The seller acknowledges you and carefully chips a fragment off a large slab with a small tool, placing it neatly inside a twisted paper packet. It feels substantial. You place a small piece on your tongue and find it intensely sweet. Almost overwhelmingly so. But there is a slightly chalky texture afterward that sticks to your palate. The irony is, it contains barely any actual sugar. That vivid pink colour, most likely achieved using red lead or cochineal insect dye, depending on the seller's morality or budget. The dry, powdery sensation in your mouth. That is because many of these inexpensive treats were bulked up with finely milled plaster of Paris, otherwise known as calcium sulfate. Ideal for construction materials. Less than ideal for dental health. And the flavouring, perhaps something labelled essence of pear drops, a manufactured chemical compound that smells like childhood but can cause headaches if used in excess. But here is the deception. You would never realise it. Not if this was your life, not if you grew up accustomed to this. Because this is not a special occasion treat. This is basic sustenance. For some, this serves as dinner. For others, it is a lunch replacement. For the minimal price of a halfpenny, you receive calories and something that simulates happiness. That is the brilliance of it. You do not need to conceal a dangerous substance when it is presented as pink sherbet or brightly striped barley sugar. You only need to ensure the taste is convincingly similar. You hear a slight cracking sound behind you. Someone else has just taken a bite of a sugary wafer. A little girl nearby pulls on her older brother's arm and shows him a fluffy marshmallow twist as large as her own hand. The shocking part is not the food itself, but how completely normal it all feels. An elderly gentleman standing near the sticky toffee stall mutters that the older candies were better. You used to be able to tell the difference between mint and lemon, he complains. Now everything tastes like a blend of artificial scent and coal dust. You observe the toffee in his grasp, which has an unnatural gleam. He consumes it regardless. What is truly peculiar is how these market stalls evolved, not primarily through malice, but as a response to public need. Genuine sugar is costly, authentic flavourings are scarce. People desire something sweet following their workday, and they require it to be inexpensive. And so the marketplace, perpetually adaptive, finds a solution. The phrase junk food does not exist yet, but its core principle is already thriving in these very stalls. You move further into the market, following a narrow aisle between two larger buildings where the crowd noticeably disperses. Here, the kiosks are more subdued, less forceful selling, more knowing looks exchanged. You stop at a display featuring striped paper sacks hanging from small hooks. The sign advertises fruit drops, but the vendor offers no verbal explanation, just a slight smile and a measuring scoop. Inside the bags you see perfectly round, vividly coloured balls that shine like pieces of stained glass. They resemble hard sweets, but with a smoother finish. The seller mentions they can calm a sore throat, soothe a slight irritation, and taste exactly like apple or raspberry. The colours are striking, almost fluorescent. But you are already aware of the secret. These drops are seldom made with real fruit. More often, it is a flavouring oil mixed into boiled sugar or something that mimics sugar, then coated with fine mineral powders to prevent them from sticking together. The bright apple-green shade comes from verdigris, a copper compound. That intense raspberry red might be cochineal if you are fortunate, or toxic lead chromate if you are not. Yet even the person selling them does not appear malevolent. He merely shrugs when asked about the origin of the sweets. Perhaps Liverpool, he suggests, or imported from elsewhere. It is difficult to confirm. He then adds that they sell particularly well when the smog is thick, as people enjoy seeing something bright when the air turns yellow. And there is that pattern again, that unspoken compromise between what people wish for and what the local market provides. You spot a wooden container nearby filled with what resembles Turkish delight. However, this particular batch has been diluted with starch and dusted so profusely it leaves your fingers completely white. It is not necessarily harmful, just lacking substance, less satisfying overall, like food that is merely pretending to be something else. The reality is these vendors are not nefarious chemists. They are simply entrepreneurs operating within the tight financial limits of a community craving affordable treats. Sugar was once the most prized commodity transported globally, but now, in this era, in this market, it is the illusion of sugar that is most profitable, and people are not naive. They can sense the quality difference. You overhear a woman cautioning her companion not to purchase from the tall man wearing a striped apron. His barley twists are supposedly made from boiled cord and varnish. "I swear it," she says with a slight laugh. But her friend buys one anyway. It only costs a halfpenny. It is sufficiently sweet. You pause by a basket, overflowing with toffee pennies. They possess just a little too much artificial luster. When you pick one up, it sticks lightly to the wrapping paper and leaves behind a pale, oily residue, more grease than proper caramel. One bite reveals an odd, metallic taste. You decide not to swallow it. You try to imagine a different world where everything that glitters, everything that smells wonderful is precisely what it claims to be. But this is clearly not that world. This is the world where most citizens are simply surviving with whatever will sustain them until the next shift, the next payday, the following morning. And so you stand still for a moment. You observe the children laughing, their fingers sticky, energized and exuberant. You watch the vendors weighing out tiny sugar mice on shaky small scales. You see the elderly man slowly enjoying his licorice drink with the calm patience of someone who has experienced every permutation of this street over many decades. There is a certain beauty to the scene, even in all its pretense. The colours, the everyday rituals, the small enduring hopes. You turn to exit the market area, your hands still tacky, your mouth still experiencing a faint fruity tingle. The city is growing dark now. Lamps flicker warmly in the shop windows, and behind you the cries of the sweet sellers continue. They are gentle, persistent, almost musical. You have just had your introduction, and you are only beginning this journey. You awaken the following morning still dwelling on that small pink confectionery cube, the one that broke apart just a bit too easily when you ate it. There was something about its texture, that powdery aftertaste that lingers more vividly in your mind than on your tongue. So today, your curiosity is driving your actions. You are no longer merely wandering, you are investigating. The morning air in the city is sharper, less scent of caramel and spice, more of coal and ground metal. You slip into a narrow side street just off the primary road, where smaller, less conspicuous vendors are setting up under canvas covers. There is one stall here you overlooked the night before. Its sign simply says "Sweets and Savouries" painted in looping red script. That is where you start your inquiries. On the counter are familiar goods, fudge squares, spiraled barley sugar sticks, even something resembling a cherry pastry beneath a glass dome. But it is what is positioned behind the stall that captures your attention. A shelf filled with glass jars, not containing candies or desserts, but powders and pigments and small bottles sealed with corks. You focus your gaze on a few: Prussian blue, red iron oxide, alum, pearl white. These are not exotic food flavourings, they are colorants, and most of them originate from minerals you would expect to find in an art supply store, not a commercial kitchen. Here is a piece of knowledge you did not possess last night. In Victorian England, colour was immensely important. A bright white bread loaf was perceived as being purer, cleaner and higher class. A vibrant green sweet looked more refreshing. A deep red drop conveyed a sense of luxury. So, naturally, shop owners, and particularly those who manufactured sweets, went to great lengths to fulfill these customer expectations. Some relied on cochineal, a red dye made from crushed insects, to achieve those magnificent reds. Others chose less expensive, artificially created alternatives such as red lead, which could lead to chronic exhaustion and joint pain over an extended period. But lead provided a brilliant colour and maintained its shade perfectly in the display window. The same principle applied to yellows and greens. Natural turmeric was appealing, but it was pricier than its chemical counterpart, chrome yellow, which was derived from lead chromate. A green apple sweet might get its glossy finish from verdigris or copper sulfate. Both looked dazzling when illuminated by gaslight. Neither belonged anywhere near the digestive system. This practice was not always done with malicious intent. More often, it was simply standard operating procedure. The individuals preparing these colorants did not necessarily view themselves as poisoners. They considered themselves as improvers, as assistants, adjusting their sweets to align with what the purchasing public already expected. The container labelled pearl white likely contained something like finely powdered chalk or gypsum used to bleach sugar, make flour appear pristine, and smooth out any imperfections in texture. All perfectly acceptable and common practices. You lightly touch the corner of a wrapped piece of toffee and your fingers pick up a faint powder. Perhaps harmless. But you're beginning to understand why so many Victorian food analysts carried small glass vials, droppers, and wire loops. Food had become a form of industrial chemistry. One analyst many years later would record in his notes that a harmless pink peppermint contained a trace of iron oxide. Another observed that barley sugar left red marks on absorbent paper, indicating cheap red pigment had been used. Yet people kept buying it. They liked the uniform texture, the intense colour, the suggestion that their inexpensive treats could look as stunning as anything displayed in a high-end French shop. Even when a few cautious reporters attempted to inform their readers about confectionery containing stone dust or chalky fondant, they were met with indifference. As one market patron reportedly quipped, "Well, it is still better than having nothing to eat." So the powders remained in use, the colours grew more intense, and people developed an association between vibrant brightness and genuine quality. Without asking too many probing questions, you turn your attention back to the jars one final time. There is one more label that draws your eye, handwritten in a slightly shaky hand. Almond Artificial. You hold it up to the light. It smells sharp, clean, almost too flawless. That is benzaldehyde, often produced chemically from coal tar derivatives. Tastes delicious, yes, but no actual almonds were ever involved. You depart the stall with your mind focused on colours that do not truly belong in edible products. And yet here they are, baked and boiled into the reality of every street corner delight. The cheerful pinks and yellows still sparkle from windows as you walk on, but now they feel like theatrical makeup, clever camouflage intended to satisfy the eye, not the body. Further down the street, you stop near a small cart selling sugar plums, though they contain no actual plums or any genuine fruit whatsoever. They are hard as pebbles, heavily coated in powder, and unnaturally shiny. The man attending the cart is meticulously rolling them in a large tin basin filled with something that looks suspiciously like powdered sugar. But given your new knowledge, it could just as easily be basic flour, starch, or even powdered alabaster. You inquire where he sources the coating, and he offers a slight smile. "A little bit of this, a little bit of that," he says, and vaguely motions toward a rough burlap sack positioned near his feet. You choose not to press him further. There is a certain quality to the ambiguity, a casual Victorian acceptance that seems to imply do not inquire too closely and you will remain unworried. The conversation shifts to the subject of competition. The vendor admits that he simply cannot afford to use completely pure ingredients. "If I made it the proper way," he states, "I would be bankrupt before the end of the week. Customers demand intense colour, good texture, and powerful sweetness, all for less than a single farthing." His voice lacks bitterness, just a sense of weariness. "So we manage with what is available." You simply nod your understanding. It is not just the food ingredients that are stretched thin. It is everyone's budget. As you continue down the pathway, you pass a window display featuring an array of marzipan fruits. They are tiny works of art, miniature pears, apples, and cherries, all expertly formed with careful attention. But the almond paste foundation has likely been replaced with mashed beans or fine breadcrumbs mixed with the artificial flavouring, a necessary compromise to keep them affordable. The compelling visual illusion is considered more essential than the actual ingredients, and this manipulation is not limited to sweets. Even the vinegar sold in the local corner shop might contain traces of sulfuric acid for an increased sourness. Even the mustard might be bulked up with turmeric-dyed flour or crushed bone powder. The key to success is always appearance. Victorians lived in a very visual culture, a world dominated by public presentation, stark social divisions, and elegant shop facades concealing meagre realities. And the food industry followed this trend. Impress the eye first, worry about digestion later. You pass a sweet shop on the corner that you would have been drawn to instantly yesterday. Glass containers, twisted sticks of candy, even a hefty toffee hammer resting on the counter for breaking up large blocks. The woman inside hums a soft tune while meticulously wrapping individual caramels. You step inside and look around. The caramels are a rich golden brown and feel soft. They adhere delicately to the paper as she folds the wrapping. They smell strongly of vanilla, but again the kind of vanilla derived not from natural pods, but from phenol-based chemical essences obtained from wood pulp or clove oil. The cost is reasonable, the taste is probably familiar, even reassuring. You recall a peculiar observation made by one of the few chemists who attempted to formally document the additives present in Victorian sweets. He once described some fruit drops as possessing a distinct flavour of cinnamon and copper wiring. Another scientist noted that a specific batch of barley sugar left clear red marks on blotting paper, a telltale sign of a cheap red pigment. But here is the critical point. Many people actually grew up tasting those precise flavours. They were not considered abnormal or strange. They were simply normal, widely accepted and expected. If a barley sugar did not leave a slight metallic aftertaste, it felt incorrect. And so the artificial ultimately became regarded as authentic. Through constant repetition, the collective public taste adapted entirely. This was simply the flavour of the current era. As you step back out onto the cobblestones, a young boy skips past you, happily sucking on something intensely bright purple. He flashes you a quick, sugar-coated smile and disappears quickly into the flow of the crowd. A horse-drawn cart rattles by noisily. The wind briefly carries a puff of artificial cinnamon scent. The sweet air almost makes you feel hungry again. The market's established rhythm continues its steady beat. And somewhere within that swirling mix of aromas and colours, the clear division between illusion and basic indulgence has vanished entirely. The next time you visit this vibrant market, you focus your gaze not on the products, but on the people buying them. It is now mid-afternoon, and the streets are more heavily populated than usual. The nearby factories have released their workers for the midday pause, and a stream of employees moves purposefully toward the shop fronts, walking quickly, methodically, like bees converging on a rich hive. You walk along with the crowd and observe what they are carrying. Not savoury meat pies or fresh vegetables, not even whole loaves of bread, only small paper packages, paper cones full of candies, biscuits neatly folded in thin waxed sheets, a stick of licorice root, a penny bun. You realise this is far more than just casual snacking. For a significant number of these workers, this constitutes their entire midday meal, and it is not a choice made from desire. A young male worker passes you, barely older than a teenager, steadily chewing a cube of something resembling honeycomb toffee. His clothing is marked with soot, his hair flattened beneath a worker's cap. He does not stop walking, does not look up, just eats as he moves with the same mechanical rhythm one might use for chewing gum. A woman wearing an apron tucked over her coat tightly holds a tin of treacle pastilles, picking at them distractedly as she navigates the dense crowd. She quickly checks the large clock tower. Perhaps 10 minutes remain before her break is over. Then it is a return to the assembly line, a return to the relentless machinery. You stand outside a busy bakery and watch a crowd pushing forward, not for fresh bread loaves, but for discounted scraps. Thin, sweetened slices of leftover bread, jam tarts that are a day old, whatever is marked as the cheapest option. The sign above them reads factory specials. There is no visible embarrassment in the transaction. It is simply part of their daily routine. That is the profound implication. The Industrial Revolution did not just alter how food was manufactured. It fundamentally changed when and why it was consumed by the masses. A proper, balanced meal containing vegetables and protein was simply impossible to manage during a 10-minute break with a 10-penny wage. But a handful of sugary buttons, which you could easily afford and carry with you, was a viable option. It became entirely commonplace to subsist on items that resembled food, provided the sensation of food, but offered no genuine nutritional value. A single biscuit here, a sugary sweet there, a hard piece of toffee for instant energy, a cheap bun for stomach bulk. The stomach received something to process. The body kept functioning. That was the only requirement. This is most obvious in the younger people, not just children, but the new young labourers already relying on these predictable habits. A young woman passes you, clutching a tiny tin of hard candy and a crust of sugary bread. She offers no smile, but chews with a steady, automatic rhythm, as though this is simply expected. You start to see how perfectly the market is tailored to this existence. Every vendor's setup is designed for haste. Grab, tear open, consume. No lingering, no utensils, no talking. It is sustenance that vanishes as fast as it's purchased. One seller offers fig cakes that contain 0 figs, only a dense jam pressed between pastry layers. They are inexpensive, heavy, and quickly absorbed by the flow of people. The same is true for the fruit pies loaded with turnip jam dyed a bright red. Yet, no one complains. Not openly, because it serves its purpose. Because even knowing there is no actual plum in the plum cake, it still occupies a space in your routine. The deeper reality slowly surfaces. Victorian convenience food did not win over the working class with its flavour. It won through utility. It was quick, easy to carry, satiating, and, in its own way, reassuring. It was sustenance that could be slotted into the narrow gaps between labour and the clock. And it was everywhere. You step into a small corner shop tucked beneath a row of smoke-blackened apartments. It is quieter here, the shelves stacked with orderly tins and paper-wrapped bundles. The shopkeeper, a man with a neat moustache and a careful method for arranging his jars, acknowledges you with a slight nod, saying little. You take your time. You watch. There are small button-shaped biscuits, each hard enough to last weeks on display. Jars of fruit, preserves lined the highest shelf, even though the labels hint at barely any actual fruit content. You see something called cocoa slabs, piled like building blocks, sweet, dusty, and vaguely chocolate-flavoured, though it's unclear what they truly contain. A small sign by the cash register catches your eye. Meal tabs. A reward between shifts. You pick up the tin and it rattles like a container of medicine. That is when you realise food is being fundamentally redesigned, not just in how it looks or costs, but in its very function. In this tiny store, everything is compressed, preserved, manufactured to slip easily into a pocket, a lunch pail, or a long work day. It makes logical sense. As factories replaced fields and shop floors replaced home kitchens, food had to become faster, smaller, and less messy. The hours once spent cooking a stew or baking a loaf were gone. In their place were sugar cakes, sweetened rolls, condensed milk, and dry biscuit portions. And this change was not merely about physical hunger. It touched on emotional needs too. These small packages of sweetness, these cheerful paper wrappers, offered people a sense of minor luxury, a fleeting moment of control, something appealing. Amidst the soot and the time cards, you strike up a hushed exchange with the shopkeeper, asking how his business is faring. He offers a slight shrug. Consistent, he tells you. They purchase the same items daily. The jam rolls, the lemon drops. I make sure to keep them stocked. There is no longer time for bags of flour or fresh loaves. He indicates a row of biscuit tins. They prefer the ones that make the most noise when they crunch. Tells a story, doesn't it? Then he gives a small private chuckle. You imagine the lives attached to each of these treats. The woman who splits a sugar cube in half to make it last her entire shift. The boy who carefully chews a licorice stick all afternoon. The clerk who pockets a hard mint before beginning another long hour at his desk. It isn't indulgence. It is survival, wrapped subtly. Back out on the street, you see the pattern even more clearly. A bakery sells steamed buns that can be rapidly cooked and eaten cold. A sweet stand advertises no crumb cakes for simple carrying. Even tea is available as a thick syrup, ready to be diluted and sipped in under 5 minutes. Victorian convenience food is not just food. It is time management. It is budgeting calories. It is the core business of staying capable. And it is gradually replacing old habits. Meals shared at home become rarer. Communal suppers shrink into solitary quick bites. Family recipes yield to industrial formulas. You pass a young man leaning against a street lamp, unwrapping a barley sugar twist. His hands are rough, his collar unfastened. He looks worn, but satisfied. He has sustained himself in his own way. The sugar shines in the fading light like polished amber, and deep inside you understand that this is not just a simple treat. It is the mechanism by which the era maintains its momentum. You head toward a bakery next, clearly a favourite in the neighbourhood judging by the crowd. The shop window is inviting, slightly misted with the internal warmth. Loaves are neatly piled into pyramids behind the glass, golden on top, with crunchy outer shells and soft insides. The air carries the faint aroma of yeast and sugar. It smells like deep comfort, like age-old custom, like something dependable. But as you step inside, the situation becomes more complex. You stand near the rear counter, observing the baker slicing a loaf for a customer. The interior is dazzlingly white, almost suspiciously so. It appears untouched, clean, a perfect opposite to the smoky streets outside. Yet something about it causes you to hesitate. You survey the shelves. All the bread here seems unusually light, not just in hue, but in actual density. The crusts shatter too easily. The interior crumb is dry, even though it's fresh. You pick up a small roll from a tray of samples. It crumbles apart in your fingers before you can take a bite. The key lies in what is not listed on the label. Alum. In this time, bakers frequently mixed in alum, a substance traditionally used to process leather to make flour appear whiter and enhance the texture of inferior dough. It gave cheap flour the appearance of purity. It firmed up the loaf, and crucially, it deceived the eye. You can almost hear the thought process in the baker's mind. Good flour costs too much. Bleached flour suggests luxury. White bread is what everyone wants, so you stretch the ingredients, you make compromises, you add a small extra element. And here is the strange part. It wasn't illegal. Not yet. Not precisely. Food regulations were imprecise. Inspections were infrequent. As long as the bread did not immediately sicken someone, it was acceptable. You taste the roll. It is acceptable. A little bland, perhaps dry, but it is bread, and that was often sufficient for a city that needed calories more than true flavour. A young clerk next to you purchases 3 rolls and requests them to be sliced and filled with treacle. It is his midday meal, he explains. The dark syrup helps it stay with you. He laughs, rubbing his stomach. You notice he does not ask what is in the bread, just smiles and pays. Behind the counter, the baker is already shaping the next batch. He dusts the work surface with flour that may or may not be entirely unadulterated. You see the small tin nearby, unmarked, just enough alum added to stiffen the dough and extend a sack of flour, an extra dozen loaves. And it is not only this bakery. You have heard the accounts now of powdered bone added to bread, of chalk used to bulk out flour, of mashed rice folded in to make it heavier. None of it harmful in small doses, but none of it truthful either. What is most striking is how commonplace it all is. No one in the shop seems troubled. The loaves are selling quickly. People appreciate how the bread looks. It is uniform, neat, simple to cut. It toasts well. Sandwiches hold their shape. But the long-term effect, that is harder to discern. Digestion becomes slow. Stomachs ache. More often, people attribute it to the damp weather, the worry, the long factory hours. They rarely blame the loaf on the table because how could something so seemingly flawless be the cause? You step behind the bakery now, not into some sinister lair of deception, but into a space that looks surprisingly routine. The workbench is worn smooth from years of constant use. Sacks of flour lean against the wall, some tied shut, others half open. A few are labelled clearly, others have no markings. Tin containers sit on a shelf, their contents a mystery to the casual observer. You see the baker again, rolling the dough with mechanical accuracy. He works quickly. There is no time for inefficiency. One arm moves like a machine, the other dusts the bench, just enough to keep the operation moving. This is not the bread of artistic creation or careful craft. This is the bread of stark necessity. And beside the dough sits a little tin box. No label, only smudged fingerprints on the lid. He opens it, pinches a small portion of pale powder between his fingers, and works it into the mixture. Alum. He is not concealing it. He is not behaving like a villain in a cheap novel. It is simply another ingredient, like salt or yeast. One of the necessary compromises of the trade. You recall a government report from years later that would confirm how widespread the practice had become. Bakers using substances like alum, chalk, or even pulverized Derbyshire stone, not to poison, but to safeguard their profits and keep up with escalating demand. In their view, it was not fraud, it was simple adaptation. A delivery boy arrives at the back entrance to collect 2 large baskets of rolls. Hospice order, he mutters. You glance at the paper. 50 buns, 30 slices, all headed for a small institution down the lane. Charity bread, stretched just a bit thinner perhaps, but still warm, still delivered. The baker sighs. Good work, he remarks, crossing his arms. Better than letting it go to waste. You nod. There is something in his tone, weariness perhaps, or a quiet dignity. He is aware of the compromises, but he is feeding countless people every single day. Which matters more, purity or making things possible? Outside again, the street is busy. Shoppers carry loaves tucked under their arms. A mother rips a roll in half and gives it to her daughter as they walk. No one discusses additives or compounds. They talk about the cost, the softness, whether the crust is sufficiently crisp. This is the outcome when scarcity and surface appearance clash. People choose what looks appealing. Bakers supply what sells. And slowly what is expected changes. A new sign is being painted over a nearby shop. Pure bread, no additives. A daring claim, probably accurate, likely expensive, and most likely ignored by the majority of those passing by. Because it is not the truth that moves units, it is the look, the texture, the price. As you wander farther down the road, you notice a discarded crust near the curb, a clean bite mark along the edge. The interior is pale and dry, not spoiled, just abandoned, and in that small, forgotten piece of bread, you see the situation clearly. How even food can become background noise, something so common it is invisible, something so fundamentally changed it is no longer questioned. You move on, past the pastry stalls, past the window displays, past the bakers who shape fantasy into basic sustenance, and somewhere in the sprawling city, another batch of alum-laced loaves rises in a warm oven, prepared to face a world that has stopped asking what true bread is meant to be. This time you are drawn by a subtle scent, not the sharp freshness of a baked loaf or the sugary burn of toffee, but something fainter, delicate, yeasty and comforting. It leads you to another bakery, one that seems older than the rest, with soot marking its windowsills and bricks darkened by long exposure to coal smoke. You push the door inward. The small bell gives a soft jingle. Inside, the light is soft, muted by the passage of time. Stained glass, wooden shelves curve along the walls, holding loaves wrapped in wax paper, round rolls in cloth-lined baskets, and small brown buns in neat arrangements. An older man, likely the proprietor, greets you with a nod. He does not speak much, but his hands move with calm assurance as he tidies pastries and checks the large oven. There is a sense of slowness in this place, more intention. You examine the loaves, which are darker than any you have seen elsewhere. Not artificially whitened, not artificially expanded with alum. These are denser, heavier, made with wholemeal, the kind of bread that evokes the memory of earth and grain, not plaster and polished surfaces. You point to a bun and ask about its contents. He shrugs and says, "Flour, salt, yeast, maybe a small amount of milk if I happen to have it." He phrases it like a small joke, but you believe him completely. And that is when he says something that will stay with you. People no longer desire bread. They desire bread that resembles cake. It clicks into place, Victorian convenience food did not begin with the confectionery. It started with the idea that food needed to be a kind of superficial display. White meant pure, tall meant rich, soft meant freshly made. And so the simple loaf had to undergo a transformation. Dark flour was viewed as cheap. Dense bread was considered unsophisticated. What people truly desired was visual perfection, pure white interiors, golden outer shells, and a feather-like texture. That is why alum became so widely used. It made even the coarsest flour look refined. Bakers could take shortcuts and still sell loaves that appeared to be of premium quality. But alum is not simply a flour whitener. It impacts digestion. Too much over time could result in stomach irritation, constipation, and internal drying. Nothing immediately severe, nothing that required hospitalization, just the kind of mild discomfort that became so regular you eventually failed to notice it. You sit down on a wooden bench close to the oven and take a bite of the old man's roll. It is substantial, satisfyingly chewy. There is a delicate sweetness from the grain itself. No metallic taste, no dusty aftertaste. It fills you up slowly, quietly, as authentic food should. He watches you, his arms crossed. Most people walk right past me now, he says. They want lightness, I give them substance. He's not resentful, just steady. A dedicated craftsman in a city that has largely forgotten the craft. As you leave the shop, the roll still in your hand, the sky is turning a gloomy grey. Smoke lingers in the air. You pass another bakery, this one more modern. Gold lettering, bright windows, clean uniforms. A line of customers extends out the door. Inside, the shelves sparkle with white loaves lined up like soldiers, each identical in size and weight. It is all visually stunning, impressive, and ultimately empty. You think back to the quiet baker kneading honest dough behind his dusty window, and you wonder how long his way of doing things can possibly survive. You continue down the street with that roll still warm in your pocket, your mind still focused on his words. They want bread that resembles cake. The notion stays with you as you wander past a new type of store, an early refined grocer, the kind that caters to the rising middle class. Its windows are spotless, its shelves perfectly organized. Inside, a young woman behind the counter is carefully arranging packages of bread wrapped in custom-branded paper. Each loaf looks flawless. Each label boasts terms like refined, pure, or extra fine. No mention of what is actually in the flour, just the powerful suggestion of high quality. You observe a customer step in, his collar perfectly ironed, his gloves spotless, and order a loaf without any hesitation. She does not examine it, does not question the whiteness or the feel. The packaging is enough. The entire purchasing experience is enough. The bread's primary role is not to provide nutrition. It is to fit a certain image. This is the new trend. Food as a form of status. Alum-laced bread was central to this, allowing bakers and grocers to meet massive demand without having to invest in better, quality grain. It kept loaves light, extended the flour supplies, and made even small bakeries appear modern and prosperous. You stop at a bench and watch carts roll by, some delivering ice, others carrying stacks of boxed loaves to nearby establishments. The bread market has become an industrial-scale operation, predictable and repeatable. You recall a flyer you saw once arguing that bread should be a uniform product, untouched by the quality of the harvest or the changing seasons. That was the promise being made. A loaf that was always the same, never disappointing. A loaf as dependable as a clock's chime. But dependability had its hidden costs. Even as far back as the 1850s, doctors were quietly noting a trend: stomach problems increasing, digestion sluggish, bowel movements inconsistent. But who could possibly prove it was the bread? People blamed strain or the polluted city air or their genetic makeup. The loaf on their plate was too much a part of their routine to question. And the idea of going back to the darker, heavier bread felt like a step backward, a poor man's food, a peasant slice. No, the collective aspiration was for lightness, whiteness, elegance. Bread that pulled apart like a sponge and melted readily under jam. That gave you the feeling, just for a short moment, that life was much easier than it actually was. You wander back toward the quiet street from before and notice something unexpected. The old baker's shop has no line, but a few neighbours are standing outside talking quietly. One of them holds a small basket of rolls. She smiles as she speaks. Her hands are dusted with flour. She looks like someone who retains old knowledge. And perhaps that is the simple, quiet truth here. Not everyone accepted the illusion. Some still valued weight, density, authenticity, not out of simple nostalgia, but because it actually made them feel full, because food at its very best was never about status or colour or texture. It was about a genuine comfort that lasted. As you walk toward home, the streets begin to blend together, but the robust taste of that heavy roll remains on your tongue. Simple, honest, slightly rough, real. And in a city of empty loaves and artificial promises, that might be the most elusive flavour of all. By now, you have learned to examine every single bite. So when you come across a milk cart parked near a row of terrace houses, you stop not just to glance, but to genuinely observe. The cart is made of wood, painted a faded pale blue and hitched to a slow-moving horse. Metal canisters shine faintly in the morning light, each with several dents from years of relentless travel. A young man with rolled-up sleeves is ladling milk into pitchers for the line of women and children. It seems straightforward enough. Milk, pure and recognisable. Surely that is safe. But as you wait, you notice something strange. The milk is not cold, nor is it truly warm. It is merely lukewarm, somewhere in the middle. There is no ice visible, no cooling rags, no urgency to keep it chilled. And when the boy hands over a pitcher, the liquid flows a little too easily. Not thick, not rich, simply thin. You remember something someone once remarked. In a bustling market, there is more river water than cow's milk in that pail. At the time, you were amused. Now, it registers differently. Milk in the industrial Victorian city was one of the most subtly manipulated products available. It was easy to tamper with and nearly impossible to check for purity. Diluting it with water became standard practice. A small amount of chalk helped it retain its white colour. A dash of starch thickened it up again. If it began to turn sour too quickly, no problem. A little bit of borax or baking soda would refresh it completely. No customer could track the entire journey from the farm to the cup. Milk often travelled many miles from rural farms, shaking over rough roads, sitting in open containers, absorbing heat, dirt and fumes. By the time it arrived in the city, it had aged rapidly, and the sellers had learned how to conceal its flaws. You watch a woman hold her pitcher up to the light. She frowns briefly, then moves on with a shrug. It will likely do for the tea, and that was the final standard. Good enough. If it did not smell sour, if it did not immediately curdle, it was accepted. But you also know that certain stomach problems, persistent ones, often began in that same cup of tea, not in the tavern. You move a little closer and see the boy rinsing out a canister with water from a bucket. The rag he is using is well past its best. He hums softly, unaware that his casual wipe is destroying the illusion of hygiene. The milk will still taste fine. The children will still drink it. But the fundamental question remains: how much of this is real sustenance and how much is simply a show? You remember reading that some of the first analyses found traces of lead in urban milk, not because it was intentionally added, but because the cans had poorly soldered seams and over time the milk absorbed what it came into contact with. Other reports mentioned lime from the washing buckets, or tin from the ladles, or even copper residue. But proper testing was rare, standards were highly flexible, and most people had no real way of knowing. You bought milk the same way you bought trust, from the same face on the same corner every single morning. And still people continued to buy it, because a cup of tea required milk, because porridge without cream felt lacking, because children expected a warm mug before heading to school. And so, even as the milk grew thinner, lighter in colour and more mysterious, it never stopped being an essential part of daily existence. You follow the milk cart as it travels on toward its next destination, another narrow street lined with neat houses, flower pots in the windows, and chimneys just beginning to emit the morning's first puffs of smoke. The cart stops again, and a new line of customers forms. Different faces, but the exact same routine. You stand near the back, simply observing. The boy dips his ladle, pauses, nods, and continues the flow. One woman hands him a farthing and quietly mentions wanting it extra thick today. He gives a wink and subtly pushes a different canister forward, its lid worn smooth, the spout slightly brighter from continuous use. Curious, you step closer and look into that canister. The milk inside is clearly thicker, creamier, with a richer colour, but something about it is off. It is too perfectly uniform, too flawless. You have a suspicion about what might have been included. In some areas of the city, milkmen were known to blend in ground sugar, arrowroot powder, or gelatin, not to improve the flavour, but to enhance the appearance. A slightly thicker texture made it seem fresher, more high quality, especially important in wealthier neighbourhoods. Sometimes they even used a small amount of animal fat, melted and carefully skimmed across the top to simulate cream. It was not toxic, it was not immediately scandalous. It was subtle, deceptive only in the way it appealed to the eye, not the stomach. But if you drank it every day, as most people did, it had a cumulative effect. Not necessarily physical harm, but a clear influence. Your taste adjusted. Your expectations gradually shifted. You began to believe that milk should look like this, taste like this. And the real product, straight from a cow, began to feel too crude. You remember a small detail from an inspector's notes, a rare trip to a farm outside the city limits. There, the milk was kept cool with damp cloths, poured into perfectly clean ceramic jugs, and sold before noon. Tastes too grassy, one city resident supposedly remarked during a taste test. A bit strange, because real, authentic food had begun to feel alien. You glance across the street and see a young boy drinking directly from a tin mug, milk dribbling down his chin. He quickly wipes it away, makes a slight grimace and tosses the remaining contents behind a nearby gate. Perhaps it had been sitting in the sun for too long. Perhaps the carefully prepared mixture had curdled just a little. Maybe that mug still had yesterday's remnants clinging to the inside. It happens. And yet, milk remained a core item in the Victorian kitchen, used constantly in tea, custards, sauces and stews. It was too difficult to avoid. For many families, it represented one of the only reliable sources of fat and calcium in their daily diet. No one could afford to simply give it up. So vendors did what they felt they had to do, extended its usable life, balanced the inherent flavour inconsistencies, covered up the changes with a little chalk here, a quick dash of soda there, all quiet, necessary deceptions. Nothing dramatic. By now, a light rain has begun to fall. The cart driver pulls a protective tarp across the canisters. You watch the small droplets gather and run down the oilskin. People continue to wait patiently in the queue. No one seems bothered by the rain. They simply pull their scarves tighter, nod to the boy, and head back home with their small metal pitchers swinging gently at their sides. You do not follow this time. You stay for a moment longer, listening to the soft splash of the horse's hooves and the gentle clink of ladles against the tin. Milk was supposed to be the simplest of things, but in this sprawling city, even simplicity had hidden layers. It is later that same day when a different sound attracts your attention. A slow, gentle bell ringing accompanied by a sing-song voice calling out into the network of alleyways. Ice cream, fresh today. The voice is clear, practiced, a familiar sound. You follow it without thinking, navigating through the crowds until you find the source. A small handcart, pushed by a man in a checked apron and a bowler hat, rattles slowly along the cobblestones. Inside the cart, a tin basin is set deep into a wooden framework, surrounded by straw and wet with melting ice water. On top of the basin sits a metal tub covered with a cloth. The man lifts the cloth just enough to reveal a pale, slightly glistening surface of ice cream. He smiles and nods. Vanilla or lemon if you prefer. A little zest. It is an appealing offer. 1 penny per scoop. You pay and watch him scrape a serving from the edge, thin, somewhat brittle and holding its shape. He wraps it in a small piece of wax paper, forms it into a crude cone and hands it over. It is cold, creamy and just slightly tart. Not necessarily bad, just unexpected. You take a second bite. That is when you detect it. An almost stale, dusty flavour beneath the sweetness. The texture is wrong, rougher than it should be, and a little wet at the edges. You do not stop eating. No one ever seems to. But something tells you this was not created in a traditional kitchen, and you would be correct. In Victorian cities, ice cream was often not what it appeared to be. It was rarely made with real cream. More commonly, it was a simple mix of milk, sometimes fresh, sometimes not. Sugar, starch, and artificial flavouring rapidly frozen in a hand-cranked tub surrounded by slowly melting ice. The ice itself was frequently gathered from rivers, nearby lakes, or even stored from the harsh winter months under a layer of sawdust in deep underground pits. Cleanliness was more of a distant hope than a reliable guarantee, and while some vendors were meticulous, boiling the milk, sterilizing the tubs, others simply poured the mixture and froze it. If the final result maintained its shape and tasted remotely sweet, it sold instantly. A writer once described ice cream vendors as creatures of opportunism, men who worked with incredible speed and confidence, not following precise recipes. Their equipment was minimal. Their ingredients were whatever was most readily available. One common quick fix was using arrowroot or flour to thicken the base. Another was adding saccharine or treacle instead of more costly, real sugar. The product reduced expenses and concealed any strange flavour notes. You lean against a post close by and survey the area. A small crowd of children has gathered near the vendor's cart. Their faces brighten as he portions the frozen dessert onto slices of old bread, crafting improvised sandwiches. A smart way to extend the portion. They giggle as the mixture runs down their hands. Yet you still can't help but think about what's actually inside that container. The truth might not be awful, but it's probably not what you'd imagine. It might contain traces of shortening or beef fat, or old milk rejuvenated with a touch of baking soda. Perhaps there are hints of saltpeter used to maintain the cold temperature longer if the vendor was especially daring. Even slivers of soap have been known to enter the mixture to achieve that rich, airy consistency. Nevertheless, the confection retains its appeal. Ice cream represented a novel, luxurious cold food in a busy, smog-filled city. It offered a moment of happiness, even if the ingredients were questionable. You take a last mouthful, noticing how rapidly it is now dissolving into the paper holder. The consistency is transforming. The heat from your fingers is undoing it. True fast food, and you realize you finished the whole thing anyway. As the ice cream cart rattles away, its chime fading into the network of narrow brick pathways and metal railings, you stay a moment longer. A light rain begins, gentle, barely enough to moisten your jacket collar, but sufficient to clear most people from the street. Still, a few devoted patrons remain sheltered under awnings, gripping their cones like small trophies of defiance. You toss the crumpled wrapper into a nearby receptacle and continue walking, your fingers sticky and your mind still registering a taste of vanilla that wasn't actually vanilla. Around the next corner, you spot another chilled dessert, a shallow metal container set into the window of a confectionery shop. Inside, small blocks of flavoured ice, rose water, lemon, even pistachio, although it's unlikely they've ever seen a real nut, rest on beds of compressed snow. They appear refined, brightly coloured with artificial dyes and gleaming beneath a sheet of glass. But you now understand how quickly that shine disappears once warm hands touch it. The woman running the shop is inside, cooling herself with a newspaper. She looks up at you with a practiced, welcoming smile, one hand still resting near the serving scoop. You inquire how long the ice has kept its form today. "Plenty long," she replies. "Long enough to sell it before it melts into a puddle. That's the silent law of Victorian serving. Move it before it gives up. If it maintains its shape, it's good. If it starts to droop, sell it quicker. Waste nothing. Time is the genuine obstacle. And time in the city does not accommodate food that requires special care." Without mechanical cooling, most ice cream was a precarious balancing act, kept in straw-lined barrels or chipped from large ice blocks harvested seasons ago. It had to be constantly shielded from heat, movement, and delays. Some vendors managed perfectly, others simply got by, and what occurred after the purchase was not their concern. You once read that certain frozen treats, especially the more inexpensive ones, were flavoured with ester compounds, which are artificial imitations of fruit or floral scents, pear, banana, almond, or even pineapple. These could be manufactured from blended acids and alcohols, sometimes in makeshift laboratories or shared cooking spaces. The result was intensely scented and convincingly sugary, but clearly unnatural. Yet, it sold. Even Queen Victoria herself was known to enjoy frozen desserts at grand banquets, though hers likely had no resemblance to the block you just consumed. The royal version was made with genuine cream, imported fruit, and snow collected by servants from distant high ground. Yours was likely mixed in a back room, frozen with pond ice and seasoned with artificial lemon oil or fake rose water. Fragrant, temporary, and just cold enough to impress you. You smile at the thought. Two distinct worlds connected by a mutual desire for something sweet on the tongue. The rain intensifies slightly. The awning above you drips with a consistent rhythm. You step back onto the walkway, passing another vendor who is now covering his pushcart with a heavy oilcloth. The leftover ice is quietly dissolving underneath. No one looks disappointed. It's expected. Get it while you can. Eat it before it flows away. And as the last residue of your ice cream memory vanishes from your fingertips, you realize a simple truth. The appeal was never solely about the flavor. It was about the pursuit, a competition against the sun, against the clock, against spoilage. The pleasure of a cold item, briefly available, then entirely gone. You lick your fingers one final time and keep moving. It is late afternoon now, and the city's pace has shifted. The open-air markets are quieter, deliveries are slowing, but you are still searching, curious, observing, following the next smell. This time it is savoury. You turn a corner into a less refined area of town where the paving stones are uneven and the shop signs hang at odd angles. A narrow entryway with a wooden sign reads "Quality Meats and Sausage," although the word quality might be an exaggeration. Inside, the shop is dimly lit, illuminated by a single hanging gas lamp. The air smells of seasonings and something older, meaty, but not freshly prepared. Behind the counter, a butcher wearing a stained covering wipes his hands on a rag and offers you a customary nod that lacks warmth. Hanging in the glass display case are thick, coiled sausages. Some are brownish, red and full, others pale and oddly spotted. You tap the glass and ask, "What goes into these?" The butcher shrugs. "Beef in that one, pork in the other. Mostly." Victorian sausages, particularly those sold in poorer neighbourhoods, were famously flexible with their components. Some meat, certainly, but also powdered bread, fine crumbs, colouring soot, and sometimes what was politely termed leftovers, cartilage, tough tissue, even connective fibres, pulverised so thoroughly you wouldn't notice. And if the meat wasn't perfectly fresh, no need to discard it. A dash of salt, a sprinkle of pepper, a bit of vinegar, and if needed, some red colouring, cochineal or even iron oxide, to bring back that healthy look. Secure the casing, twist it neatly, and it's ready for the tray. You examine it more closely. One of the sausages has an unnatural sheen. It's not moisture from the casing. It's something else. A light layer of grease or oil brushed on to reflect the light. It creates the impression of moisture, of freshness, as if it was just prepared this morning. The reality? It could have been made days ago or earlier. Preserved, wrapped, and rotated. You recall an inspector's comment from years later that some sausages contained more fantasy than actual meat, and yet they were popular, satisfying, salty, and easy to cook. Toss one into a pan with chopped onions and some tea, and you had a full meal. There is a platter of small meat pies on the counter, each roughly the size of your hand, with crimped edges and a golden crust, steam still rising from a small crack in the lid. But the filling could be anything, often a mixture of cheaper cuts, minced very fine and bulked out with seasoned flour or mashed potatoes. You buy one because, of course you do, because it smells good, and because, like everyone else, you crave something warm and substantial in your hands. It tastes acceptable, savoury, peppery, a little soft. You try not to analyse too hard what you're eating. The texture is uniform. The spices fulfill their purpose, and the crust is buttery and flaky. It's easy to see why these sold by the hundreds during factory lunch breaks. You step back outside, still chewing, as the butcher goes back to trimming another piece of meat at the wooden block. A metal bucket sits next to him, filled with scraps. He glances at it, then empties it into a trough behind the counter. Nothing wasted. In the distance, another cart delivering meat arrives to restock for the evening sales. The driver lowers covered containers onto the curb. It is impossible to tell what they hold. Chops, perhaps, or more sausages. It doesn't matter, as long as the seasoning is right. You continue your walk through the streets, now following the scent of cooked meat and wood smoke. The savoury smell is comforting in a way that overcomes any doubt. After all, despite all the uncertainties behind the butcher's screen, the city still operates on these foods. They are everywhere. They fulfill a need. You walk past a group of young men seated on the steps of a corner store, sharing a sausage roll. The pastry is breaking apart. The filling is almost unrecognisable, dark, soft, and spicy. One boy takes a bite and passes it along. None of the pretences inside. They don't require them. It tastes familiar, salty, warm. That is enough. Victorian sausages were never simply about the meat content. They were about affordability, consistency, and accessibility. Butchers quickly realised that as long as the item looked good and stayed together, the rest was negotiable. Ground grains, beef blood, sugar, and bread could all be formed into a believable shape. If it sizzled in a frying pan and didn't smell unpleasant, it sold. One particularly common tactic was using preserved scraps. Pieces of older meat kept cold or soaking in salt water until needed. A little spice covered any stale odour, and the colour was easily fixed. A few drops of meat dye gave even the most aged cut a vibrant reddish tint. As you pass another shop, you catch sight of a large piece of cured ham hanging in the window, glistening and perfectly pink. Almost too pink. You remember a detail you once read. Some hams were treated with saltpetre to preserve their hue and prevent them from turning grey. It worked well. It also gave the meat that characteristic rosy colour, even after months of storage. You stop at a grocer's display, this one offering thin sliced cold meats and small pastries wrapped in cloth. The man behind the counter offers you a taste of cured tongue. Lightly smoked, paper thin and just barely salted, it is surprisingly good. Rich, with a metallic flavour that lingers. He taps the glass jar next to him. Pickling brine, he explains, keeps everything firm, and he is correct. Pickling was the foundation of preservation in a world without dependable refrigeration. Tongue, beef, lamb, pork, they were brined in large containers, sometimes for days, sometimes weeks. It prevented spoilage but also made the texture more pliable. It allowed even lower-grade cuts to become appetizing. You take another bite, then another. It is easy to forget the questions once the flavors take hold. And that, perhaps, was the true genius of Victorian meat handling. Believable comfort. With enough salt, enough vinegar, enough spice, any piece of meat could be turned into a desired item. Food was not merely nourishment, it was a show, and each mouthful concealed 100 decisions made behind the counter. Butchers, grocers, pie sellers, they weren't con artists, they were clever problem solvers, masters of thrift. Their profession relied on intuition. How far could a portion be extended? How old was too old? Which seasoning would save the day? Back on the street, the air is getting cooler. Gas lamps flicker on one by one, and a faint smoke drifts gently from chimneys. You unwrap the final bite of your pie and enjoy it slowly. Whatever it was enough. Evening settles in, softly bathing the rooftops in a warm, flickering amber light. You walk now, not as a buyer, but as a silent spectator, reviewing the sequence of what you've eaten. The powdered candies, the white bread, the watery milk, the shiny sausages. At first they appear like separate peculiarities of a busy city, but slowly a bigger picture begins to form. Victorian convenience food wasn't just an accident of weak regulation or clever shop owners. It was created to suit a new kind of existence, one that moved faster, required longer hours, and expected more results from less input. You find yourself in a busier area now, closer to the manufacturing plants, where men and women are pouring out of tall brick buildings with metal structures and smoking smokestacks. Their pace is quick. No one delays. You follow them down the street to a group of food sellers who are just starting to set up their stands. Boiled desserts wrapped in fabric, cakes sold by the piece, meat spread sandwiches wrapped in old newspapers. It is a small economy of quick service, and it runs like a well-oiled machine. You stand next to a man sipping from a cup with a chip in it. He offers you a friendly smile and a piece of his fruit and bread mixture. You accept it with a polite nod. It is dry, sweet, a little crumbly. He chews quickly, glancing toward the clock tower, just a few minutes before the next signal. That is when it becomes clear. This food, the sweets, the crackers, the inexpensive pies, wasn't just put up with. It was necessary. It fit the schedule. In a city where breaks were short and eating took place on the move, the food had to adapt. No space for elaborate roasts or stews, no utensils, no time to sit, no long chewing, just energy in convenient bundles. A pastry in one hand, a cup in the other, and back to work before the whistle sounds. And so, the very demands of the workday created the perfect conditions for processed, extended, flavoured, dyed and diluted food to flourish. It was portable, it was consistent, it was, in its own way, ingenious. You approach a stand selling small, hard, brightly coloured candies. The vendor claims they enhance concentration. You know better than to ask about the contents, but you also understand why people keep returning for them. A woman next to you purchases half a dozen small loaves and puts them into a cloth bag. You ask if they are for dinner. For the train ride, she says. And the children? Better than nothing. Better than nothing. It's a phrase you've heard more than once now. It is not a complaint. It is an understanding, a silent agreement between the purchaser and the seller, the city and its residents. No one anticipates excellence, just something to fill the need. You reflect on what food meant before this era, how meals were once opportunities for rest, conversation, and thought. But in this new environment, meals have become movement. They've been reduced to quick, chewable moments, scattered between long hours of labour, and the system benefits from this because people who eat fast, work fast. People who don't stop to prepare food, don't stop at all. The city progresses, the factory buzzes, the clock hands turn, and somewhere below it all, a small candy quietly dissolves on the tongue. The crowd around you starts to thin out as the final signal rings and workers disappear into bars, temporary housing, or begin long walks home. You pause at the edge of the public area and observe something else. How neatly all this food fits into the pace of an entire empire. Britain, after all, wasn't just expanding overseas, it was expanding its appetite. Ships brought sugar from the Caribbean, tea from India, spices from Ceylon, and preserved meats from Australia. A global pantry flowed through the ports of London, Liverpool, and Bristol. But by the time it reached the average Londoner's hand, it had been stretched, cut, flavoured, and changed into something that suited the local rhythm and the local budget. You glance at a metal container of fruit spread in a shop window. The label shows strawberries, but the list of contents is short on actual fruit. In fact, there is a developing skill of making fruit-free spreads, created with beet syrup, thickening agent, colourings, and just a hint of real berry. Sometimes turnip or apple pulp, dyed red and thickened with tree gum, stands in convincingly. It spreads like fruit spread. It smells like fruit spread. For most people, that is sufficient. You step into a general store, watching as employees pack up customer orders, canned condensed milk with international labels, blocks of cocoa substitute wrapped in waxed paper, tea bricks from across the world. But these are not delicacies, they are necessities, daily essentials, affordable, concentrated, long-lasting, perfect for a working population with no time, limited storage, and tight finances. Even tea, once a sign of sophistication, has become part of the factory meal. Strong, dark, sometimes sharp, brewed quickly and served with thinned, chalky milk and a few spoons of rough sugar. Food has become an engine, one bite at a time. And behind that engine, a quietly clever method, not malicious, just effective. Colonial imports made cheap sugar possible. Local additives stretched that sweetness further. Flavourings took the place of items that spoil quickly. Colorants hid age and every step in the process. Each small compromise resulted in something fast, stable on a shelf and satisfying enough. You walk past a bookstore and notice a pamphlet in the window titled The Chemistry of Daily Food. Its pages, if you were to look through them, would detail the ingredients in your breakfast and the pigments in your supper. There are no protests, no boycotts, just the quiet inquiry of a few thinkers writing to those who might pay attention. Most people are not paying attention, they are focused on living in their rented rooms. Dinners are simple, a piece of plain bread, a sliver of cheese, perhaps a boiled pudding or a shared sausage roll. You walk past a tenement window and see a table set for 3. Nothing extravagant, just a platter of pickled eggs, a pitcher of thin tea, and a container of mustard. One child stirs thick syrup into cold grain mush. The room smells faintly of vinegar and salt. And in all of this, the sugars, the dyes, the starches, there is something else too. A tenacity. A city figuring out how to feed millions without enough time, enough money, or enough resources. Was it perfect? No, but it succeeded. And as the sky completely darkens and the gas lamps burn steadily against the fog, you realise that Victorian convenience food wasn't just a strange feature of the era. It was the taste of advancement, of getting by. Quick, cheap, and just plausible enough. By now, your senses have become sharper. You notice things more immediately. Colours too bright, textures too smooth, smells just slightly off. So when you step into a narrow side street that branches off behind the factories and the smell of warm grain and sweet starch wafts toward you, you follow it without hesitation. It leads to a small dining hall. Not exactly a full restaurant, just a shared kitchen operating out of a former storage space with simple wooden benches arranged beneath rows of overhead beams and walls darkened from years of cooking smoke. There is no sign outside, only the sound of serving spoons clanking against pots. Inside, it is busy. Tired workers fill the tables, their plates loaded with simple, familiar fare. Thick pieces of sweetened bread, generous helpings of cooked grain, slices of penny pudding, and cups of milky tea. Some talk quietly, others eat in silence, heads down, eyes heavy with exhaustion. The food here is modest but not unpleasant. It is designed to fill space. Warm starch, soft textures, mild flavours. Nothing strong, nothing sharp. Just energy for the walk ahead or the workday behind. You take a seat and observe the steaming bowls being served. Grain mash thickened with flour and sweetened with syrup. Bread topped with what appears to be plum spread, though it likely contains more apple or beet than plum. The pudding, brown and substantial, smells of syrup, clove and nutmeg, but you suspect there is barely any real spice, just molasses and imagination. Still, it is substantial. It satisfies. You ask the cook, a friendly woman in a flour-dusted apron, how long she's been serving this food. 20 years. Close enough, she says. Started when the cleaning facility across the street opened. Had to feed the women something they could eat fast. And that's precisely it. This is not food for enjoyment. It is food for continuation. Calories over flavour, warmth over variety. Fill the stomach, calm the nerves, keep going. You glance into the kitchen behind her and see large containers of flour-marked bulk mix, tins of thick syrup and pitchers of watered-down milk. On a shelf above, a small tin of imitation cocoa powder. Everything made to stretch, made to serve many, made to keep people moving. There is no shame in it. If anything, there is a kind of quiet pride. These meals are not extravagant, but they are reliable, predictable. When you only have 15 minutes to rest, there is comfort in knowing the pudding will be the same as it was yesterday and will be tomorrow. At the next table, 2 workers are exchanging tastes from each other's plates. Yours has more spread, one says. The other smiles and replies, "You're just envious I got the purple end." You smile. Even here, even now, sweetness has become something you pursue. You don't anticipate actual fruit. You don't demand purity. But if your spoon discovers that one corner with the most syrup, it feels like a small victory. That's what convenience food gave the city. Not just flavour or speed, but small wins, familiarity, repetition, the appearance of variety through look and colour, and the opportunity to taste something rich, even if it wasn't. You scrape the final bit of pudding from the plate and look around. Dishes are being cleared, tea is being refilled, feet are stamping against the cold stone floor. Then, one by one, the room begins to empty again. Back to work, back to life, back to the pace that never truly stops. You linger for a moment longer in the dining hall as the bench seats become empty. The light has changed. The golden glow of the gas lamps now casts soft rings on every surface, catching in the steam that still gently rises from abandoned cups of tea. There is a strange calmness here, in this interim moment, when one wave of people has left and the next has not yet arrived. The cook softly hums as she scrapes out the pudding tin. What remains is stuck in the corners, baked on, sticky, familiar. You ask her how long a quantity like that lasts. "Depends," she says. "Some days it's gone before the midday meal. Other times I have to brighten it up a little, to sell it." She points toward a small bottle next to the stove. A bit of colouring in the syrup helps, makes it look fresher. You nod. By now you've heard that story repeatedly. If it looks right, it sells. You walk back out into the lane, past the gentle light of windows, toward another structure with the faint odour of hot sugar wafting through the cracks. A confectionery workshop, just one of many hidden throughout the city, and in there, sugar isn't just sold, it's shaped. The door is slightly ajar, and with a quick look inside, you see trays of shiny sweets cooling on metal surfaces. Hard candies, twisted barley sugar, and long sticks of mint are poured, stretched, and cut. The men handling the sugar wear thick protective gloves and coverings. It is more chemical process than cooking. You recognise some of the colours, vibrant green, bright red, sapphire blue. Each batch is measured and wrapped, some intended for sweet shops, others for street carts, some perhaps headed directly to dining halls like the one you just left. But not all the components are sugar. Molasses is used instead of honey. Starch replaces fruit pulp. Thick syrup gives the impression of richness. And where real flavours are insufficient, there is always essence, banana, lemon, almond, all sold by the bottle, often produced from coal tar or wood fibre byproducts. The outcome? Food that hints at fruit and luxury, but only hints. You remember hearing once that some candies were dusted in a mineral powder to prevent them from sticking together in moist weather, and that mint drops were sometimes mixed with just a little powdered alum, giving them their characteristic crispness and sparkle. Inside the workshop, a man throws a handful of green candies into a glass jar and seals it with paper. The label reads, "Herbal lozenges for the voice." You know they are really just sugar, starch and eucalyptus flavouring, but the promise on the label for the voice gives it an air of importance, and that is the quiet brilliance of this era. The distinction between food and utility, between feeding and novelty, becomes blurred. You walk a little further, past a shop selling crackers and biscuits in tins stamped with names like Victory Mix and Empire Digestives. The packaging is bold, the contents are simple. Flour, sugar, leavening agent, and a touch of fat or vegetable shortening. Durable, dry, reliable, sweet enough to be a treat, stable enough to be rationed. You notice one last shop front before the mist gathers completely in a bakery window, this time showing sweet rolls so identical they appear machine-made. You briefly consider the number of hands that handled them, the hours they spent on warm racks, the balance between sweet nostalgia and mere appearance. Then a whistle echoes from further down the street. The factories beckon once more, and across the city, in small parcels, tucked into baskets and pockets, thousands of slight, sugary, vaguely manufactured attempts at comfort are gathered. You turn back toward the building. The following morning you find yourself drawn not to food itself but to its consequences. You stop near a quiet pharmacy's door, its large glass windows slightly veiled by condensation from inside. The items on display are not glamorous. There are no boxes of biscuits or shiny glazed buns here, only rows of dark bottles with elegantly scripted paper labels. Tonic powders, soothing drops. This is the place people visit once the thrill of the sweets has faded. You step inside. A little chime rings above the door. The air carries a slight scent of mint, sharp vinegar, and aged wood. It is quieter and cooler here. The floorboards protest, with a sound that makes all movement feel slowed and more intentional. The pharmacist standing behind the counter is a tall man, neat and clearly accustomed to being heeded. He speaks softly, yet with authority. While you look around, he is assisting a woman who requested something mild for indigestion. He suggests a soothing chalk mixture. Another customer enters, complaining of slow digestion. He is given a dark, bitter herbal liquid to be consumed before breakfast. A third person asks for a remedy to clear the system. The apothecary recommends drops of peppermint oil mixed into hot water. What strikes you most is that none of these complaints are urgent. No immediate crises, just general unease, difficulty, or a peculiar fatigue that settles in the gut after eating. You start to recognize the pattern now. Food that fills the stomach but provides no real sustenance. Meals that look fine, but leave behind a feeling of lingering heaviness. You ask the pharmacist about the most frequent customer requests. He offers a polite smile. Digestive aids. It is always the rich bread, the preserved items, and the sugared treats. Of course, he states it without condemnation. People consume too quickly, too much, or too many sweets, so they come here seeking equilibrium. Your eye catches a jar of magnesia powder intended for gas and acid reflux. It has been popular for decades, not due to reckless overindulgence, but simply routine. Eating the same white bread loaf daily, ingesting too much starchy food, washing it down with sweet tea. Somewhere in that cycle, the body loses track of its proper function. You pick up a box of rhubarb extract tablets, a gentle bowel stimulant derived from dried rhubarb root, still sold today. At the time, they were even marketed as a restorative aid. Not too strong, just enough to maintain internal movement. It is easy to envision a person's entire week following this cycle. Rich bread, sticky confections, tea sweetened with treacle, followed by a chalk powder to settle the stomach, and then rhubarb tablets. By the end of the week, this becomes its own predictable rhythm and remedy. Just as the food production adapts, so do the apothecaries. They begin to keep stock of what sells. Mint lozenges for nausea, ginger tonics for bloating, fennel blends for gas relief. Some even mix their own herbal digestive wines, sweetened, fortified concoctions designed to calm the belly while also dulling the stress of a long day. You inquire about the small lozenges in the bowl on the counter. Licorice and activated charcoal, he responds. Slightly unpleasant, but they help to bring relief. You try one. It is not pleasant, but you understand its purpose. And just like that, the pieces fall into place. Artificial treats and traditional cures, sweets and stomach powders, sugar sticks and baking soda. This is not a conflict between health and harm. It is a necessary relationship. One product generates demand for the other. One indulgence creates a customer, and the cycle quietly sustains itself. A woman exits the pharmacy with a small paper package tucked under her arm. You follow her back out into the gathering morning warmth. The street is waking up. Carts are rolling past. Bakers are already selling rolls by the dozen, and somewhere in a pocket, chalk powder patiently awaits its chance to mitigate the next indulgence. You walk a little further along the street, letting the city's sounds ebb and flow around you. Footfalls on the wet stones, a distant horn, the familiar sound of a seller's cart rattling. But your attention is again drawn to the shops that do not sell food but orbit it like satellites. The herbalist, the local chemist, the little store that deals only in powders sold in small folded packets. These are the necessary complements to every pastry, every bun, every brightly coloured sweet. You walk past another chemist's window, this one slightly more current, with ornate glass containers and glass-fronted drawers. A slate board outside lists the day's remedies. Iron tonic, soothing cough syrup, peppermint essence, bicarbonate of soda. Inside it smells sharper, like menthol and linseed oil. Two women are seated on a wooden bench against the wall, each with a small brown package tied with string. The assistant is explaining a new powder for those experiencing digestive issues after consuming white bread. You smile inwardly. You have heard this before, and the pattern is becoming crystal clear. This is not merely medicine after the fact. This is medicine integrated into the daily Victorian diet. Just as people purchase sugar by weight, they purchase powders to recover from that sugar. Just as they tolerated chalk in their milk, they relied on chalk tablets to settle their reaction to that milk. Heavy stomachs. You look toward a shelf stocked with amber bottles. Some contain laudanum, others hold clove oil, camphor or pennyroyal syrup. While a few are strong, most are gentle, soothing, familiar, the type of remedies kept in a household tin beside the tea. The assistant offers you a sample of digestive pastilles from a tin next to the counter. They are dark, minty, with a slight kick of anise. You accept one. It slightly numbs your tongue but leaves a sweet, smoky finish. Not bad at all. Most people consume one after their meals, she mentions, particularly following the cakes from the market. You recall the rows of vibrant sweets, the caramels wrapped in thin paper, the jam tarts arranged like little jewels. Each one had its counterpart, waiting here in the form of a lozenge, a powder, or a simple drop. And it was not solely for relief. There was a sense of reassurance in the routine. Victorian life did not demand perfect well-being. It required function. So, if your stomach ached after the midday meal, you did not complain. You simply took something. If your appetite failed after weeks of thin milk and heavy buns, you mixed up an iron tonic and continued with your day. One inspector's notes from the 1870s mentioned that the single most common item prescribed in certain districts was simply restorative mixture, a vague combination of sugar syrup and herbs meant to counteract the excesses of the regular food. It was treated with seriousness, but also discreetly. Outside once more, you see a young boy carrying a loaf in one hand and a small wrapped chemist's parcel in the other, likely a little chalk or peppermint powder or something to help his father sleep after dinner. And somehow it all feels complete, a system imperfect, but entirely self-contained. Cheap sweets brought people simple pleasure. Medicine gave them permission to enjoy them again the next day. The city did not view them as two separate worlds. They were a pair, a rhythm, a mutual arrangement. You look back at the chemist's window as the sunlight fades across the glass. A sweet item for the palate, a powder for the gut, and life moves forward. It is the following morning when you observe something unexpected. Down a less busy side street, not far from the main market square, but tucked away behind a row of bootmakers and bookbinders, you discover a small, modest storefront with a fresh sign. Chemical food testing. Inquiries. Welcome, you stop. It is quite plain. A single window display, a table piled with folded informational papers, and a glass cabinet filled not with edible goods but with samples. A peppermint sweet sliced open, a piece of white bread preserved in a bell jar, a jar of jam that looks more like synthetic gel than fruit, each one clearly labelled not by name but by the elements it had been tested for: copper sulfate, chalk, lead, iron oxide, aluminum. You go inside. The room has a faint aroma of paper and vinegar. Behind the wooden counter is a man wearing rounded glasses and with ink stains on his shirt cuffs. He does not resemble a doctor or a grocer. He looks like a person who asks too many questions and meticulously records every detail. "Are you curious?" he asks, with the slight knowing smile of one who understands that most visitors arrive with doubt and leave with concern. You confirm. This, he states, gesturing towards the bell jar containing the slice of bread, was tested only last week. 6 different bakers, all contained alum, 3 had added powdered chalk, and 1 included a trace of ground rice flour to keep the dough dry. He does not sound angered, only weary. The history of food analysis in Victorian England is not glamorous or dramatic. It is quiet, a long, persistent campaign waged by men in dusty laboratories and back rooms, holding up shards of toffee with tweezers and dripping chemical reagents onto jam to determine if the red colour was too vivid. They were not radicals. Many were retired chemists, clerks, or pharmacists. Just ordinary people who noticed that things tasted slightly wrong and felt compelled to investigate the reason. The man behind the counter shows you a large binder, its pages filled with neat, handwritten notes. Peppermint lozenges, iron filings detected, sparks visible when bitten. Milk from a vendor on Candler Street, 35% water, slightly alkaline. Chalk suspected, raspberry tart, red lead or cochineal. Further testing required. You look up at a small informational poster on the wall. How to detect chalk in your flour. It reads almost like a simple recipe. A teaspoon of vinegar, a pinch of flour. If it fizzes, beware. Simple instruments but revolutionary concepts. These food detectives, as they would later be known, were not attempting to bring down the commercial system. They were attempting to understand it, to shed a gentle light on what the majority had simply accepted as normal. In the shadows, you are shown a sample of barley sugar that appears perfectly normal, enticing, golden and smooth, yet with a single drop of testing liquid, the syrup immediately clouds over, becoming pale and resembling chalk. The man shakes his head sadly. "Beautiful to look at," he says, "and full of brick dust. You ask how the public reacts to this information. Some pay attention. He shrugs. Others say they would rather remain ignorant, not if it affects the enjoyment. And is not that the core tension of it all? Truth versus comfort? There is a slow but steady growth of awareness now. Newspapers are starting to publish lists of vendors deemed suspicious. Public lectures are being held in small community halls. A few women have even started bringing their own small bottles of vinegar to the market stalls, quietly performing tests before purchasing mustard or jam. The movement is minor, yet significant. You leave the shop feeling not frightened but informed, and somehow that knowledge feels empowering. You step back onto the walkway, blinking in the late morning sun, the images of the labels, vials and jars behind the chemist's glass still on your mind. It was slow, patient work inside that shop. No sudden announcements, no drama, simply a steady, systematic removal of layers. But for the first time, it felt like someone was truly looking into the composition of the food, not merely at its surface. You wander through the market again, seeing every detail differently now. The peppermint drops seem to sparkle a little too brightly. The loaves of bread appear suspiciously white. Even the raspberry jam, displayed in the sunlight of a fancy grocer's window, looks more like paint than preserved fruit. And it strikes you, once you have seen the underlying flaws, it is difficult to forget them. Just ahead, you spot another stand with pamphlets, this one propped outside a community hall entrance. A single folded sheet flutters slightly in the breeze. Its title asks, "Is your daily food deceiving you?" You pick it up. It is written clearly in simple English, a single page, cheaply but distinctly printed. It describes common contaminants, chalk, red lead, alum, and offers suggestions on how to test for them at home using heat, ink, or vinegar. One section advises, if a sweet smells like furniture polish, it likely contains synthetic pear flavouring. If your tea leaves leave a black residue on your fingers, they may have already been used and recoloured. It is not designed to incite panic. It is intended to provide guidance, empowerment, an open invitation to observe carefully. You slip it into your coat pocket and look around. A few other people have also picked up copies. You make eye contact with a man across the street, holding the identical leaflet. He nods once, not with alarm, but with mutual understanding, and slowly you grasp that this is no longer just a few curious chemists. It is gradually becoming something more widespread. At a nearby bakery, a small chalkboard sign clearly reads, "No alum used in our flour." 3 months ago, that statement might have seemed odd. Now it feels like a solemn guarantee. You duck inside. The shelves are modest. Brown loaves, treacle scones, oat cakes, but everything smells authentically warm and earthy. A woman behind the counter greets you and gestures towards the sign. "We lost a few customers initially," she tells you. "They prefer the very white kind, but more are coming back now. They said they would rather chew than worry." Her hands are dusted with white flour. Her apron is clean, but clearly well worn. You purchase a small rye roll and take a bite. It is substantial, nutty, slow to chew in that truly satisfying way. It does not crumble easily, it does not dissolve. It offers a slight resistance, and, in doing so, confirms its authenticity. You think again of the food testing facility, of the chemists with their vinegar bottles, of the leaflets fluttering in the windows. It is not a sudden sweeping revolution, not yet, but it is a definite shift in mindset. And while the enormous system of adulterated food still operates silently, fueled by convenience, by cheap imitation, by old habits, it is now being steadily monitored, questioned, not violently opposed, but carefully, patiently examined. One sweet, one slice, one simple test at a time. You continue walking, roll in hand, past the various shops, stalls, and sweet sellers. The advertising has not changed. The colours still brightly sparkle, The vendors still smile broadly, but now some people are looking closely, some people are sniffing twice, some people are beginning to ask hard questions. And in a city that previously valued illusion above nearly everything else, that might be the most surprising flavour of all. There is a livelier atmosphere in the streets today. The market is bustling as usual, but there is an added sharpness in the air. More conversations, more knowing glances exchanged among shoppers. You hear the word chalk mentioned in passing, more than just once. A group of women are standing near a fruit stall, comparing detailed observations not about price, but about the quality of the ingredients. You lean in slightly and catch the end of a comment, and the barley sugar turned my spoon black. Something is undeniably changing. You pass a row of shop fronts, and one specifically draws your attention, not for what it is selling, but for what it lacks. Its shelves are nearly bare. A small card in the window states, "Closed until fresh stock. No substitute sold." Next door, a competing grocer adopts the opposite strategy. His displays are overflowing with sweets, jams, and breads, all priced very attractively low. A mother and her child pause outside the window. The mother hesitates for a moment, then decides to move on. You follow them. The quiet conflict between genuine food and clever deception has begun to play out in the open. It is no longer only whispered about in the back rooms of chemists or written down in inspectors' logbooks. It is out here where anyone with sight, a nose, or a slightly unsettled stomach can take part. But that also suggests competition is becoming more intense. You step into a small grocer's shop that has a strong smell of treacle and dry flour. The owner is friendly, wiping his hands on his apron as he arranges tins of condensed milk. "You are in luck," he mentions. "Just received a delivery of barley flour. The real thing, too." You ask what the fruit drops next to the cash register contain. He smiles, but this time a little less confidently. "Lemon oil and sugar," he says. Then, after a short pause and a hint of yellow powder to maintain a vibrant colour, just enough to catch the eye. "Completely safe, I have been assured." You nod, because you have heard that specific phrase before. Completely safe. The kind of thing people say when they have nothing to hide but everything to lose if they question the status quo too closely. Across the counter, a ledger is open. You see several names scribbled down, suppliers, prices, and notes like, "Replace with cheaper syrup if out and keep brighter tea near window." Not outright deceit, simply clever marketing. Presentation matters. The necessary cost of remaining competitive. You ask if business is good. "Busy enough," he replies. But people are more cautious these days. They tap the loaves of bread. They smell the sweets. Some even ask if I have personally boiled the milk. He forces a laugh, but there is a note of underlying weariness in it. I do not mind. It shows they are engaged. It shows they are paying attention. You thank him and leave again, carefully stepping over a small puddle that reflects the light and glints with particles of dust and sugar. The city now feels louder, not in terms of volume, but in terms of scrutiny. People are observing details, asking critical questions, making choices when they can. But for every shop that decides to adapt, another remains stubbornly set in its ways. 2 doors down, a grocer advertises pure, imported, real tea. You go in and see large bins of loose leaf, already artificially coloured, topped with a little extra dust to increase the volume. A young boy behind the counter scoops out a sample for you with a sly wink. A good strong brew, that one. You do not need to test it to know that the strength comes from tiny iron filings, not the tea itself. It is the oldest commercial story in existence. Integrity costs more, yet integrity is slowly beginning to sell. As you exit the grocer's shop, you begin to view the city through a sharper perspective. Every single corner of the market is now a kind of test, of quality, of price, of trust. You pass a vendor offering fresh daily custard tarts from a cart, their tops glistening with a perfect even shine. But now you wonder what is responsible for that surface gleam. A touch of egg, perhaps, or more likely a light dusting of yellow colouring mixed into milk and starch to give the impression of richness. You do not stop to ask. You already feel certain of the answer. A few streets away, a different kind of quiet competition is underway. Two shops are located side by side. One is tidy, minimal, displaying signs that state things like no additives, unadulterated. The other is louder, brighter, with a window full of glistening jellies, coloured loaves and cut sweets that shimmer in unnaturally vivid hues. A woman stands between the two, her shopping basket in hand. She glances to the right, then to the left. Finally, she enters the quieter establishment. That is the true appearance of change. Small, deliberate, yet meaningful. You slip into the busier shop out of curiosity. The owner is talking cheerfully with two customers as he spoons what looks like strawberry jam into small paper tubs. "Cannot keep it in stock," he boasts. "The exact same recipe we have always used." But you notice the jar tucked beneath the counter. Dyed beet pulp, sweetened and mixed with a bit of apple jelly stirred in. Clever, cost-effective, and not technically a lie. Strawberry-flavoured was never meant to be the same as strawberry-filled. He sees you observing and gives a quick wink. Everything is a combination these days, friend. The skill lies in knowing which way to mix the ingredients. You buy nothing, but he does not seem to care. He is selling to people who do not ask questions, and many still do not. However, just around the corner, you see a market stall with a modest crowd gathered. A young man is standing next to a table covered with simple baked items. Plain scones, dark loaves, seed cakes. No bright wrappings, no coloured frosting. Just brown paper bags and a small sign that invites, "Ask what is in it." And people are indeed asking. He answers every question calmly and honestly. One woman inquires about the sweetener. "Just treacle," he confirms. "No powder, no saccharine." Another asks about the type of flour. "Local, stone-ground rye." A man examines a small biscuit, smells it carefully, and purchases a dozen. The food is not dazzling, but it is reliable. It feels trustworthy. You linger for a moment, observing the interaction. Some people ask out of genuine concern for safety. Others simply want to feel more connected to what they are serving at their tables. The very act of asking questions becomes its own small form of reassurance. And that is the realization you have now. Trust is beginning to hold more value than superficial gloss. Not everywhere, not all the time, but just enough. Enough to motivate one single baker to try a little harder. Enough to motivate one grocer to carefully label his tins. Enough to ensure that one chemist's simple vinegar test remains in high demand. As the evening darkness gathers again, you pass a tavern where labourers sip watered-down ale and eat meat pies. You overhear one of them mention, "Did you hear they have started testing the vinegar?" His friend laughs in response, but not dismissively, more like someone amused by how quickly the public is becoming aware. In a city constructed on quick fixes and speed, truth is becoming an asset. Not overwhelming, not dominant, but noticeable. And that may be sufficient to tip the scales. One honest slice, one suspicious sniff, one shopper's second thought at a time. The deceit has not ended, but now the customers are finally paying attention. As the city awakens to a new day with coal smoke in the air, shopkeepers opening their doors, carts already making their way towards the markets. You turn onto a quieter street, avoiding the main road where signs are loud and prices compete furiously, moving instead down a narrow lane where the shop fronts are older and smaller, and the people seem more reflective. You are heading toward a house you heard mentioned at the chemist's. No merchandise in the window, no sign on the door, only a brass knocker and the faint aroma of baking flour. A woman answers, apron-tied, sharp-eyed, and already busy even as she invites you in. Her hands are dusted with spice and sugar, and the scent of freshly baked goods lingers in the narrow hall. She leads you through the back of the house, where a table is set with small tins, recipe cards, and rows of folded informational leaflets with headings like "Don't be fooled by a shiny loaf" and "How to distinguish cochineal from copper." She is not a politician, not a grocer, not a scientist. She's a widow raising 3 children and is fiercely passionate about knowing the ingredients of her family's food. And over time, she has become a quiet force in her neighbourhood, sharing tips, handing out guides, and even hosting weekly meetings where boarders and housewives exchange knowledge much like recipes. You sit down as she removes a tray of spice buns from the oven. No artificial shine, no false gloss, just a soft brown crust and a dusting of real sugar. "People initially thought I was crazy," she recounts, drying her hands, asking what was in the jam, smelling the bread before buying. But then, they too started to notice the inconsistencies. "It started with her young daughter's cough," she explains, "a constant nagging tickle that would not go away. The physician dismissed it as nothing serious, but after she changed milk vendors, the cough stopped completely. That is when she started to ask questions. Now she maintains a detailed log. Vendors she trusts implicitly, products she actively avoids, which stalls add starch to their cocoa, and which meat pies change colour too quickly after purchase." Others have now joined her. One woman brings a small bottle of vinegar to test flour samples. Another clips newspaper articles listing suspicious ingredients. They meet once a week over simple tea and oat biscuits to compare their findings, trade trustworthy recipes, and compose letters to local councils, shopkeepers, and even the editors of smaller newspapers. None of them resort to marching, none of them shout. They simply ask, document, and share their knowledge, and it is proving effective. She shows you a letter she received just last week from a nearby grocer who had stopped using artificial colours in his sweets. Not because of a new regulation, but because of her customers. They kept asking questions, and he grew tired of constantly having to justify the ingredients. You smile. There is a genuine warmth to this kind of simple activism. Persistent, polite, practical. It is not about anger. It is about empowerment, about having control over what is placed on the dinner plate, about helping others achieve the same. She hands you a folded paper titled "How to Spot Real Tea" and slips a biscuit into your hand as you prepare to leave. And as you walk back towards the busy thoroughfare, it occurs to you that not all meaningful change starts in government offices. Some of it begins around simple kitchen tables, with hands dusted with flour, with one woman asking a single, important question, one market morning at a time. You tuck the biscuit into your coat pocket and carry the folded paper with you, its edges already warmed and softened by the heat of your hand. How to spot real tea. A few weeks ago, that would have seemed eccentric, perhaps overly particular, but now it feels like a necessary defence. Back on the main road, the difference is noticeable. Shop windows are glistening with colourful sweets. Loaves are shining underneath glass displays. Tins promise fresh, authentic, pure goods. But now you understand that those words are mere decoration, not actual proof. It is the quiet daily routines that reveal the truth. Who you choose to trust, what you decide to observe, how you actively make your choices. You see more subtle signs of it now. A grocer's ledger left open on the counter, which once might have only shown prices, now includes new columns labelled "tested" and "no additive." A baker has set out 2 types of bread, the regular white loaf and the no-alum loaf. The latter costs 1 penny more, but is selling out faster. And across the street, a mother is carefully guiding her young son through the market stalls. You overhear her tell him, "Not from that one, dear." He uses the chalk sugar. Her voice is not angry, merely practiced and cautious. It is happening. One woman's quiet, personal effort has expanded into a neighbourhood consensus, a shared look, a neighbour's helpful warning, a wave of careful vigilance disguised as simple common sense. But it is not without resistance. You pass a vendor arguing with a customer. "That jam is fine. I eat it myself," he insists. The woman shakes her head firmly. "Then why does it stain the spoon so badly?" He throws his hands up in frustration. "You people hear one single rumour and suddenly you all believe you are scientists." It is not a sudden fight, merely a growing friction. The food trade in the city has always depended on volume and speed. Now it is being forced to justify its actions. This development is novel, and not everybody's happy about it. Yet the strength of these women, these quiet observers, the ones watching the food, lies in their lack of need for conflict. Their impact accumulates. They collect information the way they gather recipes, bit by bit, folded and passed around. A small comment here, a written detail there, until enough people start asking the same question at the same stall, and no seller wants to be the one left stumbling for an answer. You step into a tea shop to find a little warmth. The scent is full, malty, and slightly earthy. You inquire about the leaves. The young employee offers a smile and a tin to examine. "No colour added, no sweepings," he tells you. "We have noticed customers asking more lately." He gives a slight shrug. "I suppose it is a positive thing." You agree with a nod. It is positive. Not because it is a revolution, but because it is caretaking. A city learning to scrutinise itself. People are taking back their right to know what they are purchasing, not with angry outbursts or weapons, but with simple curiosity and a dash of scepticism. And back in that secluded alley, a cooling tray of spice buns sits on a windowsill. A cluster of women are folding paper guides and securing them with simple twine. They are not rebels or social reformers, just people concerned about what their families consume. And that gentle, unyielding human force is how a significant shift begins. One kitchen at a time, one bun at a time, one query at a time. By now you have been through enough shops and stalls to recognise the indicators, not the printed signs, but the true ones. The pink that appears a little too vibrant, the bread that feels like a foam instead of having a solid crust, the confectionery that shines oddly in the dimness, and now the low rumble of something entirely new. Factories. You leave the congested alleys of small grocers and storage cellars filled with sweets, heading instead toward the city's edges, where structures rise higher and the atmosphere feels calmer. Piece by piece, London has begun to transition from market counters and stalls to a force much stronger. Production lines. Up ahead is one of the more recent buildings, long, low, and without windows, apart from a few high glass panes, covered in soot. A wooden plaque above the entrance reads, "Creighton's Foods Limited." The smell reaches you before you step inside. Sugar, grease, and something floury that is hard to pinpoint. It does not smell bad exactly, just identical. The foreman greets you at the loading dock. He is quick and efficient but cordial, clearly proud of the machinery he is about to present. Inside it is a completely different atmosphere. Rows of gears and conveyor belts move in synchronization. Large barrels continuously mix thick golden syrup that pours down metal chutes into trays. At one end of the room, dough is measured, pressed and cut into forms by mechanical arms, every single loaf an exact copy of the one before it. No baker's hands are necessary here, no flour dust on clothing, only levers, steel and precise timing. Efficiency, the foreman states with a noticeable pride. That is the way forward. You observe as endless rows of biscuits are stamped and moved by conveyor onto cooling racks. A young worker lightly brushes them with a syrup. It helps them retain their sheen, the foreman mentions. Even the ones that stay on shelves for a while still appear newly made. You move closer to examine them. They certainly look appealing, round, golden and faintly sweet to the nose. But that coating, it is not a sugar glaze, it is likely a combination of margarine and starch with a touch of colour added to boost the shade. At another station, cans of meat essence are being filled. You inquire about the contents. The man laughs softly. Oh, beef extract, some salt, flour, a little yeast. Enough to give flavour to water if you are making a soup. No actual beef, obviously. Not much money available in the budget for that. He says this matter-of-factly, not boasting but simply being practical. You walk past tall stacks of boxes marked fruitcakes, long keep, and observe something else. No visible fruit. Bits of raisin made from dyed turnip, bright red cherries composed of apple pulp and artificial colour. It is not cheating in the old tradition, it is mass production. Everything here is standardised, easily duplicated and scalable. And that is the whole purpose. This is not about providing food for one family, it is about providing food for thousands, with products that last, travel easily, and remain consistent. You ask the foreman exactly how much real fruit they use. He shrugs. It depends on the demand. Sometimes none. Sometimes a small amount, because people do not taste the difference if the spices are strong enough. And again, that strange blend of openness and compromise. Factories like this were established to fulfill a need that cities created, a need that long work shifts demanded, a need that profit margins dictated. There is no villain in this place, only flour, syrup, colour, and constant movement. A single biscuit rolls off the line and drops into a metal tin. You pick it up and for a moment it is difficult to decide if it is food or a manufactured item. You venture further into the factory, passing rows of stacked tins labelled tea cakes, breakfast rounds and luncheon bars. Everything has a label. Everything is perfectly portioned, boxed and ready for shipment. It goes to the rail yards tomorrow, the foreman informs you, tapping a clipboard. Some to Manchester, some to the ship docks, some even going overseas. Overseas, he nods. The colonies consume this product readily. Same packaging, just sometimes with a different stamp. He does not say this with pride, only with certainty. And that is the moment it truly hits you. Victorian mass-produced food, these bright-coloured biscuits, artificially flavoured teas, quick puddings were not only feeding London, they were becoming commercial exports. They were becoming symbols of efficiency, of empire, of power. You stop by a crate marked lemon drops, fine quality. One has split open and the candies are scattered across the wooden floor like tiny, precious stones. But close up, they are less impressive. The colours are muted by dust and you notice how they cling slightly to each other, not because they are fresh, but because they are coated with something that resists the air. You ask what provides their flavour. Lemon oil, or sometimes essence derived from coal. Tar mostly, the foreman replies. It smells correct, so it is sufficient. He notices your expression and adds, it does not harm anyone, at least no one who informs us. You allow the words to linger as a wheeled cart rolls past noisily. On it, tins of condensed milk, packages of starch, biscuits and bars marked fortified breakfast paste. Everything designed to stay fresh. Everything made to survive months in storage, weeks in transit, and only minutes in someone's stomach. This is nourishment purely as utility. Food that travels with the empire, food that does not decay because nothing inside of it was ever completely natural to begin with. You ask what occurs when people lodge complaints. Sometimes they send a letter, he says, or the newspapers might pick up an issue. Then we adjust the description or the packaging, perhaps substitute one artificial flavour for another. It eventually calms down. You acknowledge this. You have witnessed that phenomenon before, how the words on the container change just quickly enough to avoid the actual facts. No beef becomes beef-flavoured, fruit cake becomes spiced cake with fruit essence, pure tea becomes tea blend. Finest quality. Truth dances just out of reach. The employees here do not appear concerned. They chat, stack, stir, seal. Some smile as they sample pieces directly from the production line. For them, this is not a deception. It is business. It is advancement. The wonder of being able to supply food for so many, so fast, with such small means, and you cannot help but be impressed by the magnitude. Dozens of workers, hundreds of metal tins, thousands of packages moving outwards like clockwork. Each one holds not just food, but the illusion of ease, the sensation of being full, the recollection of a taste, and for millions throughout Britain, and soon the entire world, that is sufficient. As you exit the factory, the air feels different, smokier, heavier. You can still smell syrup clinging to your coat. In the distance, the sound of a train whistle reminds you that those crates are already moving. The era of handcrafted treats is diminishing. The era of machine-made taste has arrived. The day has grown late and your feet are starting to hurt. But your curiosity urges you forward, this time towards something seemingly simple. A cup of tea, not a full meal, not a snack, just a brief rest. A small comfort that everyone from the factory workers to the wealthy seems to treat as sacred. You turn into a small tea room, nestled between a sewing shop and a tobacco vendor. It is unassuming. A line of bentwood chairs, porcelain cups that are slightly chipped, a counter piled with bread and butter slices and buns. But the room buzzes with quiet conversation. The gentle clinking of saucers, steam rising in slow spirals above every cup. You take a seat, order a pot of strong tea, and listen. At the adjacent table, two clerks discuss their weekly pay. Behind them, an elderly couple shares a slice of seed cake and stares silently out the window. The tea arrives, dark, strong, and with a faint metallic scent. You pour, sip, and immediately feel the recognizable rush, the warmth, the slight bitterness, the relief. But then you notice something. There is an odd aftertaste, slightly sharp, somewhat flat. The colour, too, appears a little too dark, almost black. You stir the liquid and observe its movement, heavy, thick. You recall what the informational pamphlet mentioned. If your tea leaves leave a mark on your fingers or turn paper black, they have likely been used and artificially dyed. And now you are experiencing that warning. It was not rare. In fact, it was practically the norm. Victorian tea, especially the more affordable varieties, was often a recycled item, scrapings from the warehouse floor, leaves already steeped and dried again, then recoloured using iron salts, carbon black, or blue dye to restore their intense shade. Some batches even contained fragments of other leaves, unfamiliar, sharp, unrelated to the true tea plant, all blended in to make up the weight. A strong brew, absolutely, but not in the genuine sense people believed. You signal the tea room attendant and politely ask what blend they are serving. She frowns a little. The same as always, loose leaf from Medley and Sons. Good quality. People here prefer it strong, and that was the objective. Strength, not a subtle flavour. For most, a quality cup of tea meant one that was dark, hot, and quick to brew. If it could handle milk and 3 spoonfuls of sugar, it was ideal. And if the colour came from a dye rather than the leaf itself, who would ever realise? Especially when most cups contained more milk than tea anyway. You take another sip more slowly this time. There is still warmth in it, still that calming break. And perhaps that is why people did not press for more answers, because tea was not about the ingredients. It was about the tradition. About 5 minutes away from the hustle, the soot, the uncomfortable shoes, and the factories that never ceased production. And in that way, even artificially coloured, tainted tea still fulfilled its main purpose. The woman next to you drops in 2 sugar cubes and stirs gently. Her expression softens, her shoulders visibly relax. Whatever is in her cup, it is working, so you finish yours as well. Not because it is perfect, but because it is enough. As you set your empty cup back on the saucer, You notice the faint ring it leaves behind, almost a greyish stain where the tea settled. It is probably harmless, but now you know it could be more than just tea extract. You step back out onto the street. The city is cooling down quickly. Smoke from the numerous chimneys begins to spread out, flattening against the rooftops, and the yellow glow from the gas lamps spills in streaks across the cobblestones. It is the hour when everything slows, shops are closing, footsteps become less hurried, voices quiet down. But you still have one more destination in mind. You follow a narrow passage toward a shop you have only heard mentioned in conversations, one that does not sell tea, but purchases it. A tea broker. It is a low structure near the docks, constructed of stone darkened by soot and filled, you can imagine, with crates and weighing scales and the soft rustling of dried leaves inside. The walls are covered with samples. Open drawers reveal organised piles of dried tea, black, green, broken pieces, twisted, powdered. A clerk greets you, then returns to sorting a newly arrived shipment. You ask if he gets many items returned. He laughs, saying only from the few who actually understand what they are drinking. He lifts a small tin and opens it. Inside are crushed leaves so dark they look nearly purple. Factory floor residue, he explains. Dried, dyed, sold all over again. If you let it steep long enough, it will stain your mug for a week. He shrugs and places it aside. You ask if people truly care. Some do, he replies, but most customers want the strongest possible cup for the lowest cost. The source does not matter, and that is the unspoken core of the matter. Taste can be reshaped. If an entire generation grows up drinking tea that has been dyed with iron sulfate, flavoured with already used leaves, and balanced with baking soda, then that is the taste they come to expect. Anything else seems weak or wrong. Genuine tea, light, aromatic, slightly bitter, is dismissed as being too watery. And so the desire for intense strength creates a cycle that reinforces itself. Cellars utilise darker mixtures, factories recolour old leaves. Sugar masks the imperfections, milk softens the harshness, and no one examines it too closely. The broker offers you a proper cup, his personal blend, loose leaf, rich but clean tasting. You sip it slowly. It is earthy, complex, with no harshness, no dye, no sediment. You ask if he sells a lot of it. He smiles subtly. Not a great deal. It is too subtle. People think it has spoiled if it is not black like chimney soot. You place the cup down gently. He seals the tin and puts it back on the shelf. Another large crate is delivered through the door, marked for blending, not for brewing. The machinery hums softly in the back, grinding old leaves into a fine powder for packaging. That is what the majority of people will drink tomorrow morning and probably the morning after. But now at least some will hesitate. Some will look closely at the spoon. Some will ask why their tea has a metallic taste or why it leaves a ring. And when enough people begin to ask, even the most intensely brewed mixture might eventually be forced to change. You thank the broker and step back out into the evening air. The city is quieter now, but in the small kitchens across the districts, kettles are whistling, mugs are being filled, and in every cup, somewhere between the leaves and the rising steam, is a quiet question, slowly steeping. What exactly am I drinking? The city's lights are dimming now, but inside the large stone building along the Thames, the one with its classical columns and the faint scent of damp paper, candles still flicker behind the tall, dirty windows. You have arrived at the House of Commons, not for a major announcement or a protest or a shocking scandal. Tonight you are here for something smaller, quieter, a meeting buried deep within the evening's schedule. The room is mostly empty. A few members of Parliament are slumped on the benches, casually flipping through documents or muttering into their facial hair. But at the centre, a man stands up, clears his throat, and holds up a single item, a simple paper bag filled with barley sugar candy. "This," he declares, "is what our children are purchasing on every street corner of London." A few heads look up. He opens the bag, pours one piece into his palm, and holds it for them to see. Lovely, isn't it? He continues, his tone suggesting the opposite. Tested last week. It contains plaster of Paris, iron oxide, and trace amounts of copper sulfate. Someone lets out a small, dismissive sound. He turns a page in his notes. The white bread consumed every day by our working classes was found to contain alum, an agent known to cause serious digestive issues. Another rustle of papers. The vinegar in half the shops in Lambeth is diluted with sulfuric acid. A louder sound of scepticism now. So what? One MP whispers. It is vinegar. The poor have consumed worse things. You sit silently in the viewing gallery, observing. This is not a moment of high drama. It will not be featured on the front page of the papers. It is not the type of speech that inspires social unrest. But it is significant, because for the first time the discussion about food, the one that has been murmured in home kitchens, written in small pamphlets and tested in private chemist labs, is entering the official governmental record. The man speaking now is not demanding outright bans, he is requesting clear standards. What constitutes food? What substances should it be allowed to contain? Who holds the authority to decide this? But the opposition is strong. Is it the duty of the government, another MP challenges, to prevent a man from purchasing a cheap sweet? Would you expect us to inspect every single loaf of bread in every baker's window? Another MP chuckles. The room is filled with polite indifference. The speaker takes his seat, and yet you sense it. The surrounding tension has changed. The simple fact that these words were spoken in this chamber makes them undeniable. You glance over toward the clerk's desk where a stack of letters has been delivered. Appeals from ordinary housewives, local medical professionals, food quality testers, and even school teachers. Each one signed, carefully folded, marked with ink and serious intent. Their voices are not loud, but they have reached this place. One letter, still open, reads, "We do not ask for extravagance, only for safety. We request not for rich cream, but for pure milk. We ask not for the finest fruit preserves, but for jam that does not contain plaster." You exit before the final vote. There will not be one tonight. No law passed, no proposal formally put forward. But you leave feeling different than when you arrived. Because now the conversation is not only taking place behind the shop counter or in a lab or at the kitchen table, it is in Parliament. And Parliament, slow, complacent and unwilling to change though it may be, has begun to pay attention. Back out on the street, the Parliament building recedes behind you like the last flicker of a street lantern. The gaslight shimmers in small puddles left by a passing carriage. It's quiet now. Too late for deliveries. Too early for the bakers. But your feet guide you toward another building, smaller yet no less vital. You step into the reading room of a simple but well-maintained borough library. Here, amidst the gentle sound of turning pages and boots scuffing on the floor mats, a different kind of fight is taking place. It is being fought with ink, informational booklets, and quiet resolve. You move toward a small display set near the entrance. The most recent circular from the Lancet Analytical Commission sits on a small wooden stand, its title clear but impactful. Results of Food Adulteration Testing, Borough Markets, October. You read through the content slowly. Borax found in butter, copper sulfate in pickles, lead in the cider, chalk mixed into sugar. Each item listed makes a quiet impact, not just because of the substances mentioned, but because of what's omitted. No company names, no specific brands, just general categories and chemical compounds. Enough information to raise alarm, but not enough to name the guilty parties. And yet, people are paying close attention. You notice a man beside you, wearing a shopkeeper's apron, his forehead furrowed as he reads the same document. "Trying to see if my vinegar is on the list," he mutters, only half jesting. You ask if the information causes him concern. "Of course it does," he replies, "but I cannot charge a higher price than the man next door. And if he dilutes his milk, I am forced to do the same, or I will lose my customers." He folds the paper carefully, almost apologetically. We all understand it is wrong, but until it is officially illegal, it is simply business. That word surfaces again. Business. The excuse, the defence, the system that ties even those with good intentions to a cycle that encourages the worst practices. You leave the reading room with a small copy of the pamphlet tucked inside your coat. It was provided free of charge, funded by a partnership of doctors and volunteers who believe education is the only force strong enough to bring about change. And in homes across the country, similar papers are being exchanged. Some people disregard them, some scoff at the contents, but others look thoughtful. Others think carefully before purchasing the next jar of jam. Others whisper at the dinner table, "Do you think our grocer adds plaster?" It is not a dramatic uprising. It is not yet a reform movement, but it is a growing awareness. And awareness is persistent. It holds on. It remains present. Once you have learned what is in your bread, you cannot simply forget it. Once you have read about the contents of your milk, you taste it differently, and eventually that discomfort translates into demand. You pause at a newspaper vendor as you walk past. Behind the main broadsheets about the ongoing war and the Queen's activities is a slim, folded leaflet. You open it up. What is in your supper? A guide to making safer purchases, with advice for wives, tenants, single men and working cooks. It is not an act of Parliament, but it may have a wider reach, because while Parliament pays attention to letters, the market pays attention to where people spend their money. And if enough people stop purchasing harmful sweets or artificially whitened bread or green pickles that shine with copper, then even the most resistant shopkeeper will have to take notice. You put the leaflet away just as the church bells toll midnight across the city rooftops. The city is asleep, but the questions remain wide awake. The next morning starts, not with the sounds of bells or machinery, but with quiet voices. In the narrow passages of Covent Garden and Clerkenwell, in the market stalls of Spitalfields and the constant noise of Smithfield Market, something unexpected is happening. Not protests, not speeches, just murmurs. You stop by a vegetable vendor's stall. A woman is holding up a bunch of parsley, gently rubbing the leaves between her fingers. Her brow is furrowed. "It is too green," she whispers to the man behind the cart. He shrugs. You asked for fresh, but she does not drop the issue. Fresh, yes, not dyed with copper. The grocer hesitates. "Have you been reading those papers again?" She gives no answer. She places the parsley back down and continues walking. You follow her through the market and begin to see more examples of the same behaviour. A butcher defending the exact weight of his sausages. A cheese seller trying to explain his brining process. A flour merchant complaining as a customer holds a tiny amount of white powder up to the sunlight. No shouting, no organised boycotts, just people looking more closely, mouths asking more detailed questions. And it unnerves the sellers, because for many years they have depended on one simple assumption. Nobody asks, nobody looks too carefully. If the bread is white, if the tea is potent, if the jam is red, that is all that matters. But now that certainty is starting to break. At a small neighbourhood bakery, two young shopgirls are whispering together behind the counter. One glances nervously at the specials written on the chalkboard. The other quietly says that alum method. He insisted the risk was negligible. The woman simply shook her head. It wasn't about the danger. People were beginning to take notice, and that was the real worry. Not being discovered, but generating suspicion. That quiet, unsettling feeling that once it took root, refused to fade. You walked past a newsstand and the papers confirmed it. The stories no longer hidden amongst the smaller ads, but plastered right on the front page. Town council investigates bread additives. Scientist reveals pickle deceptions. Is your coffee safe? A citizen's guide. This wasn't all purely for public benefit, of course. Controversy generated sales, but the outcome was still noticeable. You drifted over to a seafood market near Southwark. The fish vendor, his arms crossed tightly, was being questioned by an elderly gentleman holding a small notepad. The shopper jabbed a piece of smoked cod with his cane. Seems a little too vibrant, wouldn't you say? The seller frowned. It's just salt and curing, same as always. Looks more like potassium chromate to me. You looked down. The fish did have an unnatural glow, a tone somewhere between amber and bright orange, almost theatrical. Yet the man stood his ground. Are you buying this or not? The customer sighed, shook his head, and walked off. The vendor muttered something beneath his breath, but you saw the quick, nervous scan of his eyes across the rest of his inventory. Just last week, nobody would have thought twice, but this week the question hung in the air like fine flour dust. What exactly is in this? And even if it remains unanswered, the question alone possesses the power to reshape how people shop, how they converse, even how they perceive taste. You slipped your hands into your coat pockets and continued on. The market retained its familiar scent, coal fumes, fresh vegetables, wet paving stones. But a subtle change was taking place beneath the surface, not louder, just deeper. The change didn't end at the vendor stalls. By the middle of the afternoon, it was repeating in coffee houses, schoolrooms, public wash yards, and even in barbershops where patrons who usually argued over horse racing and the weather were suddenly debating the exact shade of yellow in custard. You stepped inside a modest cafe just off Fleet Street. It wasn't an expensive place, just basic boiled beef, cooked apples, and tea served in mixed tableware. But every single table was occupied and buzzing. At one, 2 young office clerks were examining the jar of mustard with great distrust. At this price, one noted, it's mostly turmeric and flour, if we're fortunate. Across the small room, 2 older women leaned close over their teacups. They're saying some of the cheaper teas aren't even actual leaves. One whispered, just dried willow and iron filings. The other woman nodded, eyes wide. And the preserves? Have you heard the stories about bone glue? You couldn't help a slight smile. The mood was a blend of scandalous gossip and outright alarm, but the result was indisputable. People were discussing it, and those hushed tones moved rapidly. A little while later, passing a corner bookstall, you noticed a slim booklet propped up near the cash box. It was entitled The Working Man's Handbook to Genuine Food. Below that, in clear print, how to identify fake bread, find copper in preserves, and avoid toxins in sweets. It cost a single penny and was already completely sold out. The man tending the stall told you he could not keep them in stock. The printer promised a second run tomorrow, maybe 2,000 copies. Folks are getting smart. You gave a nod, recalling the note on the clerk's desk. In Parliament, we don't ask for luxury, only safety. That same quiet appeal was now flowing through the city's side streets and storefronts like an invisible current. And some business owners, those with cleaner goods and a degree of integrity, were catching on. At a bakery in Bloomsbury, a small slate sign declared, "Bread made with water, flour, yeast, nothing else added." It wasn't decorative or fancy, but it was a clear statement. Inside, the shelves were still only half full, but the baker looked optimistic. Honest bread doesn't rise like the others, he explained, doesn't stay perfectly white. But I would rather lose a few sales than knowingly sell poison. You asked him if his new method was working. Some days, he answered, wiping his hands. Other days, not yet. But people are observing. That's a first step. And in certain districts, small shops had started displaying their own notices. No alum used, no chalk fillers. no copper additives. Sugar tested and measured. Tea imported directly from Ceylon. No floor sweepings. These were not official government certifications. There was no seal, no established protocol, just solemn promises written in simple chalk, relying entirely on the customer's faith. But for the working families walking home after a long shift, exhausted and weary, those pledges mattered deeply. You walked past a mother pointing to a sign for her small son. "Look," she instructed, "we will purchase from here. That other place gave you stomach pain." The boy nodded seriously. He clearly remembered, and you realized this was not merely about government or pamphlets or academic science. It was about collective memory. A bad candy, a sudden sickness, a lingering sour taste, and once that memory takes hold, it seldom disappears. You continued your walk as the evening twilight descended. Shadows stretched across the cobbled streets. Shop shutters were beginning to close. Gas lanterns sputtered to life. But the day's effect wasn't over, because the city, so noisy, so dirty, so chaotic, was learning how to truly taste its provisions again. And once you begin to taste, truly taste, you start to question everything you have been consuming. Night had fully settled again over London, but the city's energy hadn't quieted. It had simply changed its focus. You stood just off Fleet Street, and something felt distinctly different in the atmosphere. Not the actual smell, the familiar fog, roasted nuts, and river damp still lingered, but the overall pulse. You moved past a printing press with late glowing windows. Inside, typesetters worked quickly, their hands flying across trays of metallic type, preparing the next morning's headlines. Heavy lead characters, inked cylinders, and stacks of fresh paper. It was the vital rhythm of a city, finally waking up to the truth. You managed a quick glance at the press proofs. One glaring headline jumped out. "The chemist speaks, what hides in your daily bread." Right underneath, a quotation. "The miller may speak the truth, but the flour itself is a deception." You permitted yourself a small, quiet smile. That sentence would be read at every breakfast table by morning, because now the powerful force of the press had joined the humble kitchen pantry. You quickly ducked into a nearby coffee house, and just as you expected, the same article was being handed from table to table like a hot delicacy. Young men in formal cravats read sections aloud. A woman wearing reading glasses underlined a paragraph with her fingernail and shook her head sadly. Behind the counter, the shopkeeper rolled her eyes dramatically. "It was never an issue last month," she grumbled. "Now, suddenly, everyone's a bread expert." And yet, you noticed, she had switched her coffee supplier. You took a slow sip of your coffee, detecting that it was much less harsh than usual. It could have been better quality beans, or perhaps, just perhaps, she had swapped that old colouring syrup for the authentic ingredient. The influence of the press wasn't just in generating scandals, it was in creating unstoppable momentum. Because once a couple of major papers seize hold of a news item, the others become desperate not to miss out. And when the subject is not some distant royalty or a foreign war, but directly involves you, your simple loaf of bread, your sweet jam, your family's next meal, that story suddenly gains serious power. You finished your drink and stepped back out into the thick fog. Down the street, a small group had gathered near a shop window. You moved closer and saw that they were not looking at a product display, but at a handwritten letter posted right behind the glass. It was from a municipal food safety inspector. He wrote in plain, straightforward language, almost apologetically. Out of 53 food samples collected from local grocers last week, 38 were found to contain harmful substitute materials. This tally includes 6 of the most widely consumed fruit preserves, 4 types of standard bread, and 2 popular brands of black tea. The letter was unofficial. It was a deliberate leak. Someone had discreetly passed it to the shop owner, who in turn decided to share it openly with the entire neighbourhood. There was no aggressive protest, no loud shouting, only a quiet wave of stunned silence. You heard one man quietly murmur, "That's the brand Margaret always buys." A young girl whispered, "We ate that jam only yesterday." Someone quietly slipped away, placing a hand instinctively on their stomach as if suddenly recalling an old pain. The news media provides the raw data, but the local talk, the gossip, gives it staying power. You remembered how earlier market whispers had caused vendors to clasp their hands nervously. Now those quiet conversations were intensifying. The printing presses churned late into the night, the news columns multiplied, and at the bottom of many pages a new chorus had emerged. Letters to the editor. Real individuals sharing real-life experiences, names and addresses attached to their concerns. One from Hackney stated, "My youngest child fell ill after eating a treat from Mr. Greeley's cart. The physician discovered traces of lead. Let all mothers take heed." Another from Whitechapel. "I am employed at the bakery. We put alum in the dough every day. I wish to stop, but until legislation forbids it, my livelihood demands it. They were brief, they were raw, they were impossible to forget." You let out a slow breath. The full truth had left the academic laboratory. It was now fully exposed on the city streets. By the time you arrived in Soho, the lamplighters had completed their rounds. Pools of comforting yellow light shimmered on the wet cobblestones, casting long, wavering shadows behind every passing carriage and vendor cart. And just up ahead, through the glass front of a tiny bookstore, you spotted it. An evening lecture just beginning. You slipped inside and quietly found an open seat near the rear. The space was cramped with uncomfortable wooden chairs, the air thick with the smell of damp wool, pipe tobacco, and ink. But no one appeared to notice. Every single person was focused on the speaker at the front, who stood behind a plain wooden desk with a single oil lamp and a simple glass jar filled with flour. He wasn't a politician, nor a religious speaker, just a chemist. Middle-aged, his shirt sleeves pushed up, with chalk dust noticeable on his cuffs. He scooped a small spoonful into the jar and began to speak, not dramatically, but with plain clarity. "This," he stated, holding up the flour sample, "was purchased from a store on Long Acre. It is sold to the public as pure wheat flour, but it is not wheat alone. It contains crushed bone fragments, a small trace of alum, powdered chalk, and a notable amount of white pipe clay." He paused for a moment. "A mother attempting to stretch one loaf into two for her family will feed her children this, and she may never understand the real reason they can't sleep soundly at night." The room did not erupt in anger. It didn't need to. Instead, there was a quiet, collective intake of breath, as if 30 people had simultaneously recalled what they ate for their own dinner. He continued by performing simple demonstrations, using basic vinegar to show the bubbling reaction of chalk and iodine to expose hidden starch. He wasn't simply revealing deceptions, he was providing essential tools. Because what good is righteous outrage if you are completely unable to act upon it? After the lecture concluded, a woman wearing a bonnet cautiously raised her hand. "What, sir, are we expected to do with this new knowledge?" He replied immediately. "Share it. Share it with your neighbours, with your local store owners, with your elected officials, and most importantly, with your own children." The room fell silent once more. Then one person clapped lightly, then another. And soon the small shop was filled with the gentle, growing sound of hopeful resolve disguised as applause. You stepped back outside carrying a small booklet he distributed. Hand-drawn diagrams clearly illustrated how to recognise spoiled tea leaves, metallic tasting sweets, and even counterfeit cocoa powder. It felt like the start of something truly new, not merely education, but a form of public resistance, and the effects were rapidly multiplying. At the very next corner, a sign outside a butcher shop read, Absolutely no saltpeter used here. And right next to it, a newspaper clipping from that morning clearly underlined, "Consumers are not helpless. Buyers determine the market." You remembered the bread seller in Bloomsbury writing his honest promise in chalk. Now others were starting to follow suit. Even the city's usual gossip sheets, so eager to mock anything remotely earnest, were now publishing lists of reputable shops right alongside their usual scandalous stories and satirical commentary. At a boarding house near Lambeth, you overheard a cook proudly announcing that she had located a flour vendor who guaranteed no tampering with alum. The residents cheered loudly. One gentleman, an elderly man in a waistcoat clearly too thin for late October, raised his teacup and jokingly declared, "To unadulterated existence." Everyone laughed heartily, but there was genuine sincerity behind the humour. The city was not yet completely fixed, not by a long shot. There were still huge barrels of diluted vinegar, still copper-treated pickles, still powdered brick dust masquerading as cocoa. But the entire city was now acutely aware. The deception was exposed. Where there had once been quiet, unquestioning consumption, there was now intense scrutiny. Where there was once only fear of higher prices, there was now a real desire for integrity, and that powerful desire could not be satisfied with lead-based sweeteners. It had to be fed with something genuine, something honest, even if it lacked the artificial gloss. You awoke the following morning to a noticeably calmer London, not because the city itself was hushed, far from it, but because something inside your own perception had softened. Maybe it was the steady rumble of delivery carts beneath the window, or the comforting scent of wood smoke curling through the slightly open shutters. Or perhaps it was simply the way the morning sun slanted through the low fog, feeling gentler, as if it was easing into the day right alongside you. But there was another, deeper reason too. You were slowly regaining trust in your own basic senses. The bread you had purchased the previous day, the one from the shop with the chalk sign, sat on your table. You carefully tore off a generous piece. It was certainly not the blindingly white loaf you'd once considered perfect. It was soft but dense, speckled with brown, and smelled faintly nutty. The crust was rough and wonderfully uneven. It was genuine. You chewed slowly, savouring the taste. It was truly good bread. You glanced down at your cup of tea, strong, earthy, with a welcome hint of natural bitterness, unlike the sugary, overly processed concoctions. It felt strange. With all this intense new awareness, you had anticipated things would feel more unpleasant, that recognizing the widespread deceit in the food you consumed would make everything worse. But instead, the opposite was true, because knowing the truth about your food doesn't ruin it. It simply restores it. You left for the day with a refreshed level of attention. The usual familiar symbols of London life greeted you. Coal dust coating the windowsills, cabbage boiling in countless alleyway pots, children happily splashing through puddles in their heavy wool socks. But your eyes kept returning, over and over, to small, quiet new symbols of change. A chalkboard outside a fishmonger now read, "No yellow dye. Request to inspect the gills." At a candy shop, two signs hung prominently side by side. Licorice 112'd. No red lead, no vermilion pigment. Even your neighbourhood grocer, once well known for his mysterious flour mixtures, now prominently displayed a new tin canister on his counter clearly labelled, tested by Inspector Barnett, Octet 25. This wasn't just simple marketing, it was a delicate exchange of trust. Because once a customer begins to ask difficult questions, the shopkeeper has only two choices: provide honest answers or permanently lose the business. You walked past a small group of school children huddled near a market stall. Their teacher, stern yet gentle, was holding up two apples. One was heavily waxed with resin to keep its shiny appearance, she explained. The other was completely natural. Tell me which one you would prefer to eat. The children gasped as she cut both of them open. One apple was dry and brittle, the other was visibly dripping with fresh juice. They pointed and laughed, but they were learning a crucial lesson. It wasn't just adults reading lengthy pamphlets and formal letters. Now the lesson was being woven directly into daily life. At a boarding school you passed later that afternoon, you spotted a blackboard listing the day's lunch. Stewed mutton, cabbage, barley pudding, and at the bottom a handwritten note. All ingredients confirmed by Mrs. Harmon. Kitchen open to inspection on Thursdays. It was such a minor detail, but imagine saying that out loud just 12 months ago. Kitchen open to inspection. You would have been ridiculed outright. Now it was a valuable selling point. You sat down on a park bench near the Thames River, watching plumes of smoke curl from the tall chimneys, lost in thought. Reflecting back on all the tiny individual moments, how did this truly begin? With dedicated chemists and social reformers certainly, but also with guilty grocers who couldn't find peace at night, with observant mothers who trusted their own intuition, with ordinary workers who shared their experiences instead of silently tolerating them. And how, in some subtle way, all of that restless energy had finally stirred the city. Not with a sudden roar of thunder, but with a quiet whisper, then a noticeable ripple, and finally a powerful tide. And now the tide was definitively shifting. Not suddenly, not with a grand formal proclamation from high authorities, but with the subtle change of ordinary hands adopting new habits. You strolled through Covent Garden as the evening twilight began to fall. Vendors were quickly packing up their stalls, loudly calling out the last of their remaining goods. A woman whose arms were full of fresh turnips paused to carefully read a sign posted on the nearby wall. It read, "Proposal for a standard food quality bill to be presented next month in the House of Commons." You immediately recognise the name of the legislative sponsor, a quiet member of Parliament, known more for his enthusiastic love of cricket than for radical causes. And yet, there it was, a genuine motion addressing the very real issue of food integrity. The daily conversations of tired housewives and diligent clerks, of pragmatic bakers and wary butchers, had finally resonated loudly enough for someone in power to listen closely. You smiled faintly. It had taken many decades. It took sickness and death. It took pamphlets and letters and uncomfortable lectures in cold rooms. It took chalkboards and tin labels and dedicated bakers finally refusing to take dangerous shortcuts. But something fundamental had truly begun. The baker on Chancery Lane had cautiously increased his prices by a halfpenny and yet still completely sold out his stock every single day. The grocer near St Giles no longer bothered stocking the absolute cheapest teas and had gained a whole new group of regular customers who politely asked, "Is this the reliable blend?" Even the old pie vendor who used to brag about his vividly glowing crusts now grumbled, "No dyes, no flour additives, not since last April." You paused by the river again, sitting on the same bench as you did this morning, watching the heavy barges drift down the Thames. The wind picked up slightly, bringing the familiar scent of salt and coal. Behind you, a small boy was tossing crumbs to the pigeons, thick, hearty pieces of crust that looked unmistakably pure. No one felt the need to tell him to stop. You took a deep breath. This was not yet a perfect London. You still heard persistent rumours of powdered brick dust in cocoa, of cheap soap being sold as cheese, of miracle cure-all tonics that were primarily just vinegar and artificial dyes. But now, when someone whispered those stories, they were met with distinct disapproval, not simply indifference. Because now people fully understood that food could be deceitful, and more importantly, they deeply believed that it should never be. That was the essence of this quiet revolution. Not an angry riot in the city streets, but a determined housewife walking out of a shop because she had actually read the label. Not a child mindlessly throwing away a sweet because it tasted distinctly wrong. Not fear, but simple, earned discernment. and that quiet discernment spread much faster than any disease ever could. You leaned back as the sky continued to darken. Tomorrow, the newspapers would run yet another story, perhaps concerning vinegar or poorly sealed tin cans or something entirely new that no one had yet suspected. And another citizen would learn the truth. Another simple chalkboard would appear. Another vital pamphlet would be handed out. Another shopkeeper would carefully weigh the hidden cost of honesty and decide at last to stop adding chalk to their flour supply. And somewhere, a tired mother would slice open a loaf of bread, pour a cup of tea, and serve supper to her family with the simple newfound assurance, "This will not make us sick." It took many years to completely contaminate the nation's food supply, and it will likely take many more years to fully restore it. But the important work had finally begun, not with fire, not with fury, but with taste, with memory, with the simple, quiet courage to say, "We will not accept this anymore." You closed your eyes and allowed that quiet truth to carry you towards sleep. Let your breathing slow and steady. Now the chaotic city faded into a soft, distant hum behind you. Lamplit streets, quiet, distant footsteps, the last slow roll of a cart on the cobblestones. But you didn't need to pursue the story any further into the night. You had walked right through the very heart of it. You had witnessed how something as mundane as a simple loaf of bread could actually bear the huge weight of an entire era. How jam and tea, common vinegar and flour, everyday items once completely taken for granted, had suddenly become vital battlegrounds for personal dignity. And yet somehow it was never solely about the public outrage, it was ultimately about care. The immense care of a mother watching her child sleep soundly after a truly safe supper. The ethical care of a grocer who deliberately chose integrity over huge profit margins. The scientific care of a chemist toiling in a cold room, testing sugar cubes late into the night. That kind of profound care doesn't generate loud headlines. It doesn't earn grand public statues, but it fundamentally alters everything. So now, as you settled into your own quiet evening, recognize that history wasn't always a loud event. Sometimes it moved in tiny teaspoons, in small crumbs, in quiet individual refusals to sell poison regardless of how small the financial reward. And somewhere, tucked away behind all the noise and drama of the entire Victorian age, was the gentle yet powerful revolution of ordinary people who simply demanded that their basic food must be real. So breathe deeply and easily. Let the fog roll gently across your thoughts and fall asleep with this genuine comfort. You now know exactly what is in your bread, and that sometimes is truly enough.